Hey everyone, it's Enderman with a lowercase c. Before the story begins, I just want to say, in case you didn't know, this is a sequel to the stories that you see on screen now, so be sure and go listen to those first if you haven't. You can find them linked in chronological order in the playlist down below. It was a night with a barely visible waning moon in April 1945, and around the ruins of a crumbling medieval castle was an ongoing siege, but one unlike those that had been designed to withstand from centuries ago. This one did not involve siege towers and swordsmen fighting on the battlements. This one saw planes flying over, dropping bombs, and soldiers, armed not with swords and bows but with guns, into the field as they made a mad dash towards the guarded gates. Royal Air Force planes flew overhead, dropping bombs onto the ruins, sending rubble tumbling down onto those within the walls. On the fields outside were scattered companies of British and American paratroopers, their scattered locations revealed by their flashes of gunfire, struggling to gain any ground towards the castle. Within the castle, defending its walls by shooting at the soldiers below from the tall battlements, from windows in the towers, and from the gates, others hurrying through the courtyards and up old towers, was a large coalition of Nazi soldiers, made up of the remnants of several battalions from all over Poland, all having joined together in the same easily defendable position, after enduring different desperate battles in Poland that had all gone ill for them, to hold out in and make their stand in. So far, they were holding the castle, and for the Allied forces outside, they found trying to get close was like walking into a meat grinder. Like knights and armies from centuries before that were shot at by arrows as they stormed the gate, many soldiers were now lying dead in the field, struck by so many bullets that it looked like they'd run through a steel-bladed shredder. In some places, soldiers lay, trying to avoid being shot by the Germans on the walls, right next to a pile of red meat that had once been a fellow man of their company. In the wake of the scattered paratroopers trying to approach the heavily defended castle was left a mess of gore-splattered and blood-soaked field. The Nazis on the battlements fired relentlessly down at them. Many MG-34 machine guns had been positioned on the battlement so they could fire down into the field, and the only advantage the troops on the ground had was that it was too dark out for them to be spotted. For them, it was a battle they were losing. This holdout proved more resilient than any of the other Nazi forces retreating all over Europe had been. Even as bombs fell on the ruin like rain, the castle walls would not fall, having been built well and strong. And every time a bomb exploded, it illuminated the battlefield, and the Nazis on the battlements could hone in their aim on groups or scattered individuals below them in the field. One British paratrooper stood and tried to rush towards the wall right as a flash of light from an explosion occurred, and he was spotted and immediately shot through the throat by a skilled sniper high above. With a sudden gurgle, he toppled onto the ground, landing on his own weapon. Other troops, some of whom had been among the divisions to parachute into Normandy on D-Day, took shots up at the walls and battlements from their positions, hidden in craters or in bushes, but none of their bullets could find their mark due to the angle they were firing from. Amid the raging battle, two of the Nazi soldiers were dragging a struggling man into the castle courtyard through its main gate, one who had made a successful mad dash to the gate. The soldiers on the wall had seen him. They'd seen someone ducking in a shrub blink a flashlight on and off exactly 4 times before suddenly jumping out and sprinting for the gate, a satchel slung over their shoulder and their weapon being left lying in the dirt. They let him pass. As soon as he ran inside the gate, he'd been grabbed by 2 of the German soldiers who had been crouched just inside of the threshold on either side. The man in their grip was an American, and he was struggling to get free from the grasp of the 2 soldiers dragging him along. Above the courtyard, the top of a tower exploded as a bomb was dropped on it from a passing plane. Old stone rained down in that corner and crushed several Nazis who could not scramble out of the way in time, and several shouting German soldiers ran past the 2 as they hauled their prisoner along, heading towards the gate to renew their defense there. The 2 holding the struggling American spat vicious orders out to him and carted him further into the ruin that was the stronghold of the holdout. As the battle raged outside, they hauled him into the inner courtyard and stopped in front of an SS officer who looked like he was far too busy to worry about a captured prisoner. though he gave the American a look of disgust and a sneer. The soldiers pulled the struggling man to a stop and restrained him, speaking to their commander in loud voices. The captured man tried to speak, but he was beaten over the head and fell silent. The officer, a colonel, regarded him for a moment with disdain, and it seemed like he was about to speak when another man emerged from a doorway and walked into the courtyard. Even amid the chaos of running soldiers, planes flying overhead dropping bombs, and fires raging, he was calm and seemed to not be bothered. In fact, he looked annoyed, like one who had been interrupted during something important. The colonel turned and saluted as the man, who clearly wasn't a soldier at all but a civilian, but obviously commanded great respect to the soldiers around him, stomped up. He was slender-built, with blonde hair cut at eye level, and had blue eyes that looked like they could pierce ice and make it melt. The man stepped past the colonel and eyed the prisoner coldly and said something in German. They exchanged words in their own language for a moment before the blonde man looked at the captured one and said in English, "You're American?" "Yes." "Who are you?" The captured man struggled. "I'm the spy you were in communication with. I brought the documents you wanted." He tried to get free from the grip of the two soldiers who were holding him, but they held on tightly. One of the troops who had grabbed the man had taken a satchel from him, and he now pulled it off his own shoulder and passed it to the leader. The blonde man took it, opened it, and pulled out a thick packet of files clipped together. He gasped softly as if in awe and began flipping through them, dropping the bag and holding the papers with almost reverence. His eyes gleamed brightly with joy as he saw what they contained, and he even chuckled in excited jubilation. He looked like a man who had finally gotten something he long desired. He looked like he wanted to jump for joy. It was accounts, descriptions, blueprints, calculations, design, pages of research, everything he would need. Very pleased, he flipped through the papers, scanning them, and paused at one that had 2 pictures of 2 servicemen on it. The blonde man paused and looked at the 2 pictures on the page. There was a note pinned to it that listed them as key witnesses to Happy Easter. Pondering this, the blonde man began to read the page and turned away and gave a signal to the soldiers holding the prisoner with a jerk of his head. Holding his prize tight, he went to walk back towards the ruins. The spy tried to shrug out of the grasp of the soldiers holding him and follow, but they held on tightly and started pulling him again. "Hey!" he protested, shouting after the blonde man, who stopped. "I held up my end! Tell them to let me go!" the spy shouted, struggling. The blonde man did not look back. He didn't take his eyes off his prize. The American was pleading now as he was pulled by the soldiers who had first grabbed him, but the blonde man still did not turn around or even look away from the documents. Still reading them, he simply called back to the American, "You should have learned, my friend, that when you make a deal with the devil, he will eventually stab you in the back." And with that, the blonde man walked back into the doorway he'd emerged from and headed back inside of the ruins with the documents. "No, please, I held up my end!" the American called as he was dragged by the 2 soldiers holding him up into one of the towers. He fought the entire way up the old spiral staircase, but it did him no good. He couldn't get free. The spy was marched up the stairs to the top of the crumbling tower, the thick stone walls muffling the sound of the battle outside but not totally canceling out the rumble of explosions. At the top, a rope was tied around his neck, and he was thrown out of a window. With a scream, he fell a short distance, the rope went taut around his throat, then his neck snapped, and he was left dangling by the rope outside of the tower. April 1946. The World War was over. The Nazis had surrendered in May 1945, and Japan followed shortly afterward in August. Finally, after years of conflict, there was peace. The fighting was done for the most part. However, even as the world celebrated peace, after years of being torn to the literal brink of anarchy, the fighting truly had not ended. For the first few months after the end of the war in Europe, multiple garrisons of Nazi soldiers refused to surrender. They dug in and carried on the fight. Many islands in the Pacific were in the same situation. Scattered across the Pacific Ocean, the floor of which was now dotted with more crashed planes and sunk ships than the ocean was islands, were several holdouts of Imperial Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender despite the end of the war. As far as the world knew, all the Nazi holdouts had surrendered in just a few months, Though it was known several groups of soldiers from Japan still stubbornly refused to give up, those islands were considered lost causes and best avoided. What the world didn't know was that in the ruins of a medieval era castle, one with tall, thick walls and several high towers, was a single remaining coalition of Nazi soldiers dug in and still refusing to surrender. An attempted siege by the British and then the American ground forces resulted in a stalemate. They couldn't breach the walls. The Soviets likewise had the same results and then seemed to just not care enough to keep trying to force them out, leaving it up to the British and the Americans because their eyes were on Berlin. After Nazi Germany surrendered, the choice was made to pull back and prevent the Nazis from leaving, but also not approach again. The amount of losses the Allies got from each attack, even after bombarding the area with bombs and shells, and expected to incur if they attempted a siege with enough forces to overwhelm those inside, was deemed too great for the price of capturing a single remaining group of Nazi soldiers who couldn't even leave the castle and were not a threat to anyone anymore. They instead chose to besiege the area around the castle and watch and wait for either the Nazis inside to try and leave or for them to surrender. The Soviets were there too, not with the besiegers, but watching from a distance. For now, they were content to just watch and let their enemies incur some losses trying to outlast what they saw as nothing more than a harmless terrorist group. The government of the Allies, meanwhile, watched the holdout closely, wary of who they might have been hiding. They believed certain individuals who should have been hauled off to the Nuremberg trials were held up among the soldiers, if they hadn't escaped to South America in the immediate aftermath of the war. Also, among those in the castle was possibly one of Germany's best scientific minds who disappeared in 1945, around the time the soldiers first held up inside the castle. Because of this, along with records and a few statements from former commanders of the Third Reich, the Allies believed he was there. The United States was especially concerned that the Soviet Union might try to cut a deal to let him slip away from the castle or use other means to capture him if he was there. They knew that if they believed he was in there, the Soviets likely did too, and the individual was one both countries wanted. He was near to the top of both countries' lists of unaccounted for Germans they wanted to recruit. The individual they believed inside was a brilliant medieval and ancient history historian, an ancient military strategist, and scientist on theoretical physics, as well as perhaps one of the best scientists to serve under the Third Reich who had not already been scooped up by either the Soviet Union or the United States. He had been involved in some of the Nazis' most secretive, advanced scientific projects. He was easily recognized due to his straight blonde hair that he always kept to eye length, his piercing blue eyes, his tall stature, thin build, and always calm but calculating face. He was always thinking, calculating, pondering things. And if a man could get either country into the next level of technology first, it was him. Though, in a just world, he would have been arrested if caught, both countries knew they would cut him a deal if they were the ones who reached him. His name was Arne Wolf. And the United States in particular wanted him very badly. Not just for how smart he was, but for how valuable he'd be to them in the new Cold War slowly brewing with the Soviet Union. But all attempts to breach the castle walls were unsuccessful. All parley attempts were rejected. And no one wanted to throw a large enough force at it when the casualties would be high compared to the number of Nazis inside to capture him. So he and his dug-in group of holdouts were left to their own devices, under constant guard but not approached. However, the reasons the United States wanted to capture him abruptly changed in January 1946. A lone Nazi had seemingly lost his nerve and defected, fleeing the castle in the night unnoticed and running straight into the arms of the soldiers surrounding the castle, stationed at a distance well outside of gunshot range, willingly surrendering to whatever fate they would subject him to. And what he said to the higher commanders of the U.S. military when brought before them for questioning on the inside workings of the holdout had sent a shock of momentary panic through them, because if the Soviet Union now got Arne, he knew a secret of the United States they had thought completely buried. Arne had documents given to him by a spy he'd executed immediately after that detailed everything about Operation Happy Easter, or as it was also called, the Philadelphia Experiment. Following the experiment, which had gone horrifically wrong when attempted, all records of it were destroyed or covered up. But a spy had made copies in secret and took them to the Holdout, slipping in during the last big attempt to break through the Germans' defense. Now, with those documents and blueprints in hand, Arne had successfully duplicated the technology and successfully produced a miniature version of the very machinery that turned the USS Eldridge invisible and done other things to the ship that most, even those who had been there on that day, were not aware of. Army commanders who were in the know knew that if the Soviets got Arne first, because one of them would eventually get him, it would be disastrous. But if he had the technology, they also knew that they couldn't openly siege again because he could escape with it and do unfathomable damage depending on how he chose to weaponize it. Army Command instead began all manner of plans, from a desperate massive attack from both land and air that would simply overwhelm the Nazis before they could do anything with the technology they now had, to even the idea of dropping another atomic bomb on the ruins and wiping out everything there, including the machinery, but they also knew getting that idea approved would never happen even if it wasn't in Soviet territory. Among those attempting to come up with a plan was General Ehrenmohr, who had been there on the day Happy Easter occurred. Ehrenmohr, however, had another plan in mind. Take the covert route and either sabotage or otherwise find a manner of destroying the technology or the Germans themselves, including Arne. He was too dangerous now to even risk being left alive and able to communicate with the Soviet Union about what he had learned from the documents. The Soviet Union, learning the technology existed and what it could do, was the very last thing the United States wanted. In the eyes of some, it would be worse than if the Soviet Union developed a more powerful atomic bomb first. The game was the same, just like it had been when the experiment was being conducted. Whoever got the technology first and refined it would hold all the cards. Whoever could turn their ships, tanks, vehicles, and planes invisible like the USS Eldridge had been would be unstoppable. And as much as he hated it, there were only 2 individuals he would trust with this mission, because they were the only 2 left now, save for some of the few highest-ranked individuals in the US military and government, who knew the ramifications of the technology the Nazis had from first-hand experience with it, and he would not let anyone else be in the know about it until it was the very last option. Once, he had picked them by the random chance of one of the 2 having a sibling caught in the middle of a secret experiment. The second time he'd gone to them was in the hopes they'd be silenced trying to complete an impossible mission he'd tasked them. This time, it was necessity that he would need them. William Phillips awoke on his bunk on the USS Wright AV-1 and rolled onto his left side with a tired groan. It was April, and they were now heading home after having been stationed in Shanghai since January. It was a much better gig than the Alaska patrol, though he didn't think the fish was as good as it was in Alaska. The water here wasn't cold enough to kill you in minutes, though. Like his former ship, the USS YP-73, the USS Wright, or the San Clemente as she had been renamed to, was an auxiliary ship, one of a kind, which had been launched way back in 1920. She was an old girl, older than Phillips was, but reliable. She had actually sighted one of the Japanese aircraft carriers on the night of December 6, 1941, but due to a miscommunication, her message that might have warned Pearl Harbor had not been understood as a sighting of the Japanese fleet in the area the night before the attack. As the Navy sailor rolled over, he opened his eyes and gazed down at the floor for a moment as his foggy mind cleared. It still felt unreal all these months later that the war was over, though they were still so busy rebuilding that it didn't feel like it was over yet. But the world didn't recover from a world war overnight. After the celebrations ended, everyone realized there was a big mess to clean up everywhere. And that had actually proven to be the crux of his inner turmoil. The Alaska Patrol had at least let him feel like he was getting something accomplished by watching one of the United States' most valuable points. Now, he just felt like a babysitter and was thankful to be heading out of Asia for a break. As miserable as the Alaska patrol was, he at least felt like he was useful and keeping people safe. They were now leaving Chinese waters, passed by Japan, and were bound for home. They were bound for Pearl Harbor. They were due to be in port by the end of the day. They'd sail right past the ruins of the sunken USS Arizona. Everyone always gathered on deck and silently paid respect to the vessel and her crew as they sailed by. She was a permanent reminder of the toll that they all saw every time they arrived or left. A silent monument to not only the date which will live in infamy, but also the war, and all those who were lost in it as well. But it was over now. The fighting was done, and the battles were won. Phillips jumped out from his bunk with a grunt. It was not a comfortable one. John Bride, his best friend and fellow sailor, stirred on the lower bunk as Phillips landed with a thump on the ground next to him. "Since when are you an early riser?" Bride asked, opening his eyes. "Since it's the last night I'll have to sleep in that bed." "Yeah, cave floor would probably be more comfortable," Bride agreed, also sitting up and stretching. "The warehouse floor definitely was." "Ain't that a sad fact? You'd think the Navy would invest in better beds for us," Phillips said. The two got dressed and, without much conversation, went to their station on deck for their shift on the watch. They stood by the railing at one of the gun turrets and stared out at the ocean. They fell silent and sank into their own private thoughts. Bride, however, was feeling much the same as Phillips was. "You remember when we were talking about the kind of trippy thoughts time travel made us have?" Bride asked Phillips a while later, while they were still on watch. "Mm-hmm," Phillips answered, taking his eyes off the ocean that, months before, would have been filled with Japanese warships. "Well, you know what really feels trippy to think about sometimes?" Bride asked. "Version 2. Like, we became friends with him, and over the past year there have been countless times I've thought, I wonder how he's doing. And then I remember he doesn't exist yet. It's just weird to think about." Phillips nodded and leaned back against the ship's railing. "You know what being on watch like this makes me think about?" "What?" "Being in the Alaskan Navy doesn't exactly bring up good memories," Phillips said, looking back out at the ocean again. He and Bride had both been part of the patrol guarding the coast of Alaska during the last few years of the war, a circumstance brought about due to a last-minute transfer. The ship they'd been on, the YP-73, had been wrecked on a reef the January before. Shortly after the crash, she had slid off the reef and sunk. Phillips and Bride were both among the lucky ones who survived, and they only just did. Phillips had nearly drowned in the sinking. Bride felt the same way as Phillips did, and both hoped that they'd never experience being on a sinking ship again. Thankfully, they were nearing port and would soon be off duty and not have to think about those memories again for a while. "I miss it, though," Phillips added. "I miss the feeling of actually having a purpose, watching for the enemy. There's no enemy out here now, so why do we have to do this? Waste oxygen?" "Would you take being on the YP-73 again after she struck that reef?" Bride asked. Phillips shook his head. "Hell no. I hope to God I'm never on a sinking ship again. The patrol, I might take it if it meant getting to actually ensure doing something productive." Despite the world being at war for over half a decade, the two had not experienced direct combat in most of the war like their fellows had, be they sailors or ground troops. They didn't get to throw that punch back at Japan they wanted to after Pearl Harbor. After Operation Happy Easter had gone wrong, General Aaronmore had wanted them, two of the key witnesses, to be moved somewhere they couldn't speak to as many people about what they had seen, so he'd shipped them off to the Alaska Patrol. Then, after the YP-73 was wrecked on a reef in January 1945, he'd made a move to permanently silence them by sending them into Nazi-occupied Poland to do an impossible task. They'd failed, but survived, only to get wound up in another skirmish with an insane Nazi colonel and his little band of extremists. The colonel, Hermann Vormann, had thought using a secret weapon the Nazis had created could win the war, a device known as Die Glocke. He'd been correct in the potential it had, but had still died, desperately clinging to what he saw as his only hope at bringing the Reich back from annihilation. The entire time they were chasing his group, Phillips and Bride never knew his name. It wasn't until the skirmish was over and the colonel lay dead on the side of the road that they'd learned. As they'd gone to leave the area, Phillips stopped, thinking that our guys might want to know this asshole is dead. He might have been someone noteworthy to them. He checked the colonel's body until he found some identification and read his name. Then, he and Bride had finally left the area, and that was the last combat of any kind they had experienced in the war. Now that the war was over, they hoped it would stay that way, that the new Cold War with the Soviet Union would not get hot and start the whole thing over again. But even though for now there was peace, what they found was that the memories of the horror they'd seen did not end when the war did. They stayed with you. Even though they didn't have any stories of storming the beaches, or battling in the snow-filled forests of Europe, or in the crocodile-filled swamps of the Pacific Islands, or watching always for that U-boat trailing your ship and hunting you, they still did have their own war horror stories and traumas, as much as anyone else who fought in it. Deglaka had not just been an ambitious idea or false rumors. The Nazis had built it, and it worked. It was a working time machine. However, there was a flip side to it all. During the war, they at least felt like they were making a difference, even if it was small. Ever since the end of the war, they had felt like passive observers who couldn't influence anything going on. They'd felt listless and adrift for a while, going through the motions and unable to actually cause change. Such as with what they were doing now. What was the point of standing on watch if there were no enemy submarines, fleets, or planes to watch for? What did they achieve by staring out at the ocean? They'd wanted to go to the Atlantic and fight U-boats, but at the last minute they'd been robbed of that opportunity. While being in the Alaskan Navy was not fun, there, they at least did feel like they were accomplishing something that helped people. They didn't feel useless. The only time in the entire war they felt like they'd accomplished something at all that truly did make a difference was stopping the Nazis from using Deglaka. But since then, they'd felt almost useless at helping make a difference or rebuild. Pointless described it almost perfectly. Did we make the right choice? Bride asked after a few moments of silence passed. To stay here instead of going back when version 2 went with Deglaka. The Nazis' secret weapon didn't just work in theory. It had hurled them and the Nazis trying to use it 100 years into the future. They'd been stuck there for days because even though they had taken Deglaka from the Nazis, they didn't know how to work it, and then the Nazis had found them again and stolen it back. By the time the fight for it was over, they were back in 1945, along with a friend who they had met in the future. That friend, version 2, had actually been the one who killed Vorman before he could escape with Deglaka. They then sent him home with the device, briefly debating if they should go with him or stay, and in the end they chose to stay. Phillips didn't answer. He just stared out at the ocean because he actually didn't know the answer. He thought he did at the time, so did Bride, but both weren't sure now if they should have decided so fast. Deep down, they felt like they had made the right choice, but doubt was gnawing at them. Here, they felt useless, but the future that they had seen had also not been a good one. Rather, one where society had collapsed into an apocalyptic mess overrun with dangerous animals that looked like something they'd come straight from your nightmares, alongside scattered communities of people. However, they had also met a good friend who would have helped them adapt if they had gone back. And if they had gone back with version 2, then maybe in the future they could have helped some of the good people still alive in that world they glimpsed. Like the ones in the community version 2 said he lived with. But they also hadn't told anyone about the future they had seen. They hadn't told anyone about Deglaka either. The only thing they ever told was that they got into a skirmish with German troops while traveling through enemy-held territory while trying to reach an area held by their allies. I mean, a fresh start would have been nice. In hindsight, I'd almost take it over what we're doing now. I know I was adamant at the time that we had to stay, but I've also had a lot more time to think since then. Our brothers are gone, and we both made a good friend during the whole incident with Diglaka. And since then, I felt useless. Philip sighed in response and only said, I think Tom and Blake would have liked him too, he said, referring to version 2. He looked at Bride and smirked. Once they got to know him. Yeah, they might have freaked out at first. You know, in some ways, spending time with him did kind of remind me of spending time with them once we also got to actually know him. They missed Tom and Blake and didn't know what happened to them. There were times, more so now than ever, that the loss really hit them more frequently than it tended to during the war. Just like the memories, the loss and pain of it all did not fade once the war was over. It lingered. Ultimately, they didn't know the answer to the question because who could? No one who was still alive, save them, had experienced something like it when they had stopped the Nazis from using Diglaka. But at least the war was over now. So even though the memory stayed with you, they could make a fresh start once their service to the Navy was over. They'd both been discussing moving to the northwest coast somewhere. What they didn't know, though, was someone was waiting to speak with them once their ship reached Hawaii. A lot of memories they wanted to forget would get dragged back out of the depths once he did, and the war would be real for them again. As the USS San Clemente reached port, the men on board paying respect to the Arizona as they passed her, her sailors disembarked from the ship in Hawaii. Phillips and Bride, who had been looking forward to shore leave and finally having solid ground under their feet again, were pulled aside by the captain shortly before the ship docked. Don't rush off. We were radioed a few hours ago. Someone wants to speak with you once we reach port. He's at the airfield somewhere. They didn't get a more specific location out of their captain, who dismissed them right away, and they'd been led from the ship's bridge by one of the crew. Typical, Phillips said. Give us orders, but don't tell us where to go. Hey, Captain! The airfield isn't just one building! But as it turned out, they didn't need to search the whole base. Once the ship arrived and the two left the ship and stepped onto the pier, they found a car waiting for them. They were escorted straight to the airfield, and once there, they were led by 2 Marines into a private room, and the door was shut behind them. And the anticipation of who they were meeting finally proved to be as foreboding as it had begun to feel in their guts, because waiting for them in the room was General Aaron Moore himself. No, not again with you, Phillips said, but the general didn't react to his comment. Hello again, gentlemen, he greeted. Yes, it's regrettable we have to meet in circumstances like this again, more so than ever, now that the war is over. I understand your displeasure at this, Aaron Moore said. Phillips and Bride were silent. They had been since they walked into the room and met eyes with the general who had sent them on to the USS Eldridge to investigate after Happy Easter had gone wrong, and who had sent them on a suicide mission in Poland just before the war ended in the hopes they would die in the attempt. He hadn't reappeared in their lives since that day in April the year before, but here he was again. This time, however, they both noticed, Aaron Moore seemed more fearful and even desperate, but he was trying to hide it behind his stern poker face. But here we are again, and this time, our meeting is more crucial than ever. Phillips crossed his arms, seething. You have some damn gall to come turning up in front of us again after the fucking exodus we went through the last time we had a talk with you, his voice raising into a shout. He began ranting. Stop a train! You don't know how to operate! Or actually, just die trying, because I don't want you two to talk about anything. I bet you're really sad to hear we nearly did. We were strung up in a tree and left hanging there. Then, we nearly died falling off the train, only to run into an insane colonel who thought he could still win the war. After we survive all that, and it seems like we're rid of you, only for you to turn up here again and expect us to just go along with this game for the 3rd time. Aaron Moore did not deny anything. He looked indifferent and impatient, but he didn't interrupt. Bride didn't speak through any of Phillips's rant. Just glared. The general noticed the timid, skittish sailor he'd met on the morning of Happy Easter's test was gone, and a much more stoic, grown-up sailor was in his place. These two were no longer the men he could just push around. He sighed, but Phillips interrupted, over Aaronmore and anything he had to say to them. Come on, admit it. You're sad to hear we weren't found by our boys hanging from that tree. If you're done, what I have to say cannot wait for trivial disagreements like these, Aaronmore spat, leaning against the table that was in the room. I brought you two here, not because I wanted to, but because certain circumstances have arisen that forced my hand this time. I would have preferred to forget you two thorns ever existed, due to your service in killing one of the commanders in the German army who was a thorn throughout the entire war. Someone I thought would have been safely on the gold train and not running across the countryside of Poland with a group of insane men. But I can't. Not with what has happened. Will you hear me out? For once, he was asking and not telling, and that alone took the steam out of Phillips and gave him and Bride pause. They shared a glance and then both turned to face the general, who took a deep breath and began. I'm not stringing you two along this time. I'm going to be completely open about all of it. I'll answer all your questions. He stopped and sighed, then continued. Now from the beginning. This is a long story, so I'll try to keep it brief. Ask if you need clarification on anything. After the war ended, there were multiple holdouts in Europe. Nazis dug in and refusing to surrender. Some carried on fighting. Others just didn't know the war was over. Well, it's been 11 months since Nazi Germany surrendered, but only 7 since the holdout on Bear Island surrendered in September of last year. Now, there's only one left. One the public at large does not know about. They're dug deep into an old medieval castle, located on a very strategic and defendable spot. It's why we couldn't take it in 1945, and it was determined to not be worth the life it would cost to take down the last group of soldiers who are not a real risk to anyone. So, we set up a perimeter around the castle and waited for them to die, try to leave, or surrender. Well, there must be good stores in there because they haven't died, nor have they surrendered. We also know that, during the first big push to take the castle, a spy slipped inside. How do we know all this? Bride asked. The stoic Aaronmore turned to gaze at him. One of their own defected, escaped in the night and ran to us. It's why we now know there's a greater risk than we expected at play than a group of soldiers holding up in a castle. The spy was an American. He was killed by the Nazis after he delivered something to them. Apparently his skeleton is still dangling out of the window it was thrown from. And now we come to the crux. The experiment on October 28th, 1943. Phillips and Bride startled, both feeling truly shaken. It was the first time Aaronmore had ever acknowledged to them since that day that the experiment occurred. After the experiment on that date went wrong, all of the technology involved was destroyed, and all records and research and designs for it were too covered up. But as it turns out, there was a spy on the inside. He was working for Nazi Germany, either out of loyalty or just because he was paid off, we don't know. Near the end of the war, he stole or copied files, research, documents, plans, blueprints, and then fled to Europe and infiltrated the battle and delivered the documents to the Nazis. He was the spy the defector told us about who is now hanging from the window. And now the Nazis in the castle have those documents. They know all about the experiment, what happened, and what the machinery can do. But I'm afraid that is still not all. Aaronmore paused and rubbed his eyes, looking like a tired old man. Then he looked up at the two sailors again. You two will recall that when the USS Eldridge disappeared at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, she not only reappeared at that location as planned, but she also reappeared at Norfolk, Virginia, 200 miles away. Yes? We heard something about that, Bride said. Phillips nodded. Rumors, he clarified. He wanted to snap and remind Aaronmore that the experiment was what made their siblings disappear, but he chose to bite his tongue and remain silent. The same day everything happened, there was a lot of talk going around. I don't really remember much of it, Bride added. Aaronmore nodded. Yes, On the base, we couldn't stop everyone who was at the shipyard, nor those on the ships in Virginia who saw her and phoned to the base to ask what the ship was doing there, from talking before we'd given them all the same non-disclosure agreements we gave you two. Well, those thankfully stopped any further rumors from going around. Treason is a good way to threaten someone into silence, Phillips muttered, interrupting. So I was hoping they get killed on a suicide mission you send them on. Aramore continued like Phillips had not spoken. There was another detail about that you two were not privy to. No one was. I know that much. No one made the connection, thank God, but now you two have the need to know. Aramore paused, then he continued. The ships that saw the Eldridge at Norfolk wrote in their logs the time she appeared. When she appeared at Norfolk, it was 10 seconds before she was actually made invisible at the shipyard. She didn't just seemingly teleport through space. She also traveled back 10 seconds in time. Phillips and Bride stared at Aramore, hardly believing it despite themselves. Their own experiences with Diglaka made it all too clear to them that time travel was not impossible. But of course, you need ask, why does it matter? What can they do with it? Well, the defector also told us who is leading the Nazis. His name is Arne Wolf. We have long suspected he was there, but now it is confirmed. Some of us hoped he had fled to South America, but no. Wolf was not a soldier, but the soldiers inside are unofficially under his command and have been since they dug in. And for good reason. Wolf is a genius. A scientist and physicist who helped build the rockets the Germans were using. Was always involved in the crazed ideas Hitler had. Knows as much about theoretical physics as anyone in this country, and more so, I'd reckon. And is an expert on ancient and medieval history, particularly in Europe. If anyone on Earth could make sense of what was in those documents and use it, it would be him. Our fear, and the defector confirmed it, is that Wolf could see the potential of the machinery allowing things to move through time, and use the technology for this purpose. If he harnessed that, he could undo the Allied victory of the war or cause 1,000 other catastrophes, and we know now that he has indeed constructed a miniature version of the same machinery that was installed on the USS Eldridge that caused all of this. Small enough that it can fit in the back of a vehicle, but powerful enough to channel the energy needed to function. He has created a smaller and more mobile version of the same machinery that moved her, the Eldridge, through time. The Eldridge moved through time by mere accident, so in theory, the machinery could be used to do the same intentionally. Wolf seems to think so. With his unique expertise on history, Wolf could choose any event from any point in time to reshape how history played out and change God only knows what to undo our victory. Give Germany the atomic bomb first, tip off Hitler about the real plans of D-Day, tell him when and where our forces will attempt recapturing certain countries. And the defector also told us he not only has built the machinery, but is actively testing it and creating a plan for using it. Aramore paced the room for a moment. And that is exactly what he is doing. His plan is to undo our victory, though what exactly he plans to change the defector did not know. Wolf is keeping that to himself, buries himself in books and records and spends hours thinking on them in history, looking at things from all angles. We cannot risk openly attacking them now that they have the machinery working. The damage that could do to history cannot be overstated. He could even twist it further, make the machinery into a mind-altering weapon. Or something that turns them all invisible, God forbid, on top of creating a functioning time machine. If we attack now and back them into a corner, they will use it, and two things will happen. One, who knows? Who knows what the machinery could do, but the potential uses are enough to chill a corpse in the Arctic. And two, the secret would be out. If we openly attacked them, there would be no keeping the fact that technology and machinery exists under wraps. Within days, the Soviet Union would know and would be rushing to create their own version. Since you two are already in the know, You're the only ones we have left for a covert operation to stop this. And since you both know what the technology is capable of doing to someone, you understand why it has to be stopped. Now. Phillips and Bride took everything the general said to them in and looked at each other, feeling like they'd been punched in the guts. Phillips shook his head, looking like he wanted to hit something. Why do the Nazis want to time travel so much? He hissed. He then whipped around to gaze at Airmore again with a suspicious glare. You seem to be awfully accepting of all this. Even people who know what the machinery could potentially do might think you're overreacting. Sounds like everyone at the top pyramid with you are just worried about the Soviets getting the technology more than anything else, he added after a moment of silence. It is true that most agree there is danger of that, but they don't understand the potential for the real danger. That if the Eldridge was moved through time by the same technology the Nazis now have, then they can do it too, and weaponize it. Some of my fellow commanders simply don't seem to understand, Aaronmore said. But Phillips wasn't done with his accusations. Even the defector probably didn't believe any of this. He probably thought this Arne Wolf was crazy and decided to get out of it all alive, he said. Aaronmore hesitantly nodded. I saw things in the First World War, when I was in the trenches, that opened my mind to the impossible being possible. And the events that happened on that day in 1943 also tell me I'm not overreacting to the danger. You two, however, do seem to likewise be awfully accepting of what I'm saying. Why is that? Phillips and Bride were taken aback for a moment at the call-out. They glanced at each other. We saw things in the Second World War that opened our minds to the impossible being possible, Phillips eventually replied, to which Bride nodded. And not just on the Eldridge either, he admitted. A silence then fell. During it, he and Phillips looked at each other and thought, this isn't their first hurrah with time travel. Why us? Bride finally asked, and not anyone else who was at the shipyard. Because you two are the only ones left. Everyone else who was there that we could ask, ones who would be better in some cases, died in the war, Aaronmore snapped, with obvious disdain for them that he was no longer trying to conceal. Some died in the sinking of the St. Augustine in 1944. Some died on Tinian, and others still died on the Great Lakes when the YP-577 went up in an unexplained explosion. Several sailors who had been on the Eldridge when the experiment went wrong died there. The usually stoic and now slightly flustered Aaronmore admitted, seemingly accidentally saying too much and trying to choose his words carefully, even though they both were now easily reading between the lines as Aaronmore spoke. I scattered everyone who went on to, or were already on, the Eldridge far and wide after the experiment. Some to the Atlantic, some to the Pacific. Some who saw the worst of the afflictions the experiment caused I sent to isolated positions where there would be less people they could potentially talk to. And they all died in the war, he finished hesitantly. Except you two. Phillips stopped his muttering and faced Aaronmore now, shaking his head. You son of a bitch. You killed all of them. Like you tried to do to us, very covertly too. How ironic now that you want us for a covert mission, Bride added. Even more so now that you're also begging us to help you this time. He would have laughed. Phillips, meanwhile, took a step closer to the general and put a finger out. What did you do? Put a bomb on the YP-577? Make sure some certain boys were in the front of the landing craft on Tinian? Did you have a hand in arranging the sinking of the St. Augustine? Did you order her to sail in the direction of other ships and hope they'd collide? He accused. I won't tell you two that you're wrong. The time for dancing around and keeping the cards secret are gone. We need to be swift this time and not play games. But with that, then you two must also realize how severe the situation is. Do you think I wanted to come groveling to you both on my knees to beg you to do this if it wasn't the only option we had? At both keeping the experiment secret and stopping all this? This time, I am not ordering you to. I'm begging you to. This time, I cannot force you to do anything. I can only ask that you do. And I believe you will. Because you know, and so do I, that it has to be done. If the machinery gets used by that last group of Nazis, or escapes and is caught by the Soviets, what do you think will happen? Neither of the sailors spoke. They didn't have to say it out loud. The technology that had been dreamed would stop the world war would spiral the world into another if it got spread into the hands of multiple countries. Aaronmore seemed to read their thoughts because he nodded. Indeed. And as you two see, we are in a tight corner. One, only growing tighter now that these Nazis have and are hoping to use the technology, and because the Soviets are starting to get antsy about us still being in Poland. We've paid off the government of Poland enough for them to appease the Soviets about our presence for now, but it will not last. If they decide to make things hot, then the corner will only be tighter. It'll just get tighter when it comes to keeping this secret. And as I said, we are already in a tight corner now. One you want us to get you out of, Phillips said. He wasn't asking. It was a statement. Aaronmore deeply exhaled. And in return for that service, I have something to offer you. He leaned back against the table. You will never see me again. If you two agree to help us in stopping Wolf and keeping the technology created for Operation Happy Easter secret, and you pull it off, I promise you both that you'll never see me again, and I'll forget that you both saw things that day that never need see the light of day. You have my word on that. I'll forget you two were there that day. If we accept the mission, Bride said. Aaronmore nodded. If you accept the mission. And I say again, you two know, more than anyone else, why the technology must remain secret. You know what it can do by accident, let alone if used with malicious intent. Bride looked at Phillips and he sighed. Phillips didn't speak, but also turned to look at his friend and they locked eyes. The game board has been set. The die are cast. And this is the hand we're dealt. We have to play this time. But this time, I have laid the cards out before you both. Will you accept the mission to stop these madmen? Aaronmore said. Unlike when they were sent on to the Elderidge, or when Aaronmore forced them to hunt for the gold train, when they were forced and had no choice, this time they felt they couldn't refuse. Aaronmore was right. They knew what the machinery could do all too well by accident. What it could do in the hands of the Nazis was enough to make them lose sleep. Time travel is real, Bride muttered. He looked at Phillips and then turned away from Aaronmore. We knew that already. What I mean is, time travel is real. The machinery that was on the Eldridge is also real. What it did and can do is real. What it could also do, we now know is real. Aaronmore said he saw things that made the impossible seem possible. So they're real. What other stories are real? What stories that we heard from the last few years of monsters attacking soldiers are real, or of weird encounters on the ocean? What legends everyone laughs at are real? William, we have to do it, but what are we going to find in Poland? Aaronmore's words had been both an eye-opener and something that filled them with a feeling of dread in their guts. Hopefully nothing more than a holdout refusing to surrender, Phillips eventually said. And nothing crazy this time, because you know as well as I do, he's right. John, we can't let the machinery stay in the hands of the Nazis. I agree. We have to do it. Bride locked eyes with him and nodded. He knew Phillips was right. And now, it was time to again step into uncharted territory, into the impossible being possible, where the craziest legend or story might prove true. They'd seen the impossible enough times to know that it was true. Machinery turning people into homicidal maniacs, the Nazis hiding away a whole train, Deglaka, living dinosaurs, and anything even as crazy sounding as Aaronmore's explanation was, could prove true. The craziest, most fantastical sounding story of time machines, secret weapons, monsters, and more now had the potential to really exist somewhere, and that fact had never hit them before, but it did now. All the implications and realizations were enough to also make them lose sleep, because the world was suddenly a much scarier place than it had been. And going back to Poland might very well land them in the middle of such an impossible event, or in the jaws of an impossible monster, or in an impossible adventure once again. But they knew they had to do it because Aramor was right about the technology needing to stay a secret. It wasn't just the impossible being possible. They had to brave the impossible to stop the impossible. They both turned back and faced the general. "We'll do it," Bride said. Aramor nodded. "Good." According to the defector, Wolf is not quite ready to enact his plan, but he is close, and will likely move faster now that one of their own has fled the castle. You leave for Europe in 2 days. You'll be taken to where our forces are staged around the castle. Under the cover at night, you two will sneak in, disguise yourselves or find another way to stay hidden, and destroy the machinery if you can find it, or burn the documents. Kill Wolf if you can. Cut the head off the snake and his troops won't know what to do, especially if he's keeping his plan a secret. He's too dangerous to be allowed to live now, and we're willing to incur the loss of his unique expertise for the price of the secret remaining as such. Aramor paused and then added, "Study up on your German before you ship out. Study hard, become fluent. You need to blend in." As Phillips and Bride left him, Phillips turned to his friend and said, "Again, what is it with the Nazis and always wanting to time travel? I bet this Arne Wolf had a hand in the creation of De Glocke if he came up with such a plan," Bride added as he and Phillips left the building and stepped out onto the airfield. Watching a plane as it coasted down the runway and took off with a roar into the sky. Phillips and Bride watched it fly away into the distance. The World War was over, but there was still one last battle that was about to be fought in it. For them, VE Day was no longer valid. It was surreal being back in Poland, surrounded by a battalion of armed soldiers. The last time had been a year earlier, when the war was still ongoing, and now it felt like nothing had changed. Though a lot had changed in the last year around the world, here nothing had. In this spot of Poland, battle lines were still drawn, tanks were ready to push into enemy-held territory like bulldozers, and armed men still held their ground in trenches. Phillips and Bride had thought that was something they'd never experience again. It had been 3 days since their meeting with Aramor, and all their fellow servicemen around them knew was that the two new arrivals were being tasked with entering the castle in a secret stealth operation. Encircling the castle was a mixed coalition of mostly American and British troops, staged far enough back to be out of the range of machine guns and snipers. Trenches had been dug encircling the castle, and tanks were positioned in strategic locations, turrets pointing towards the ancient walls and ready to fire at the battlements at a moment's notice. They were briefed on the layout and history of the castle. It was built sometime around 1280 AD, but the exact year was disputed in different sources, but it was likely prior to the Third Mongol invasion of 1287. A few noteworthy kings had lived there in the centuries after, but it had been abandoned for centuries by the time of Hitler's invasion of Poland. If one went inside the main gate, beyond there would be a courtyard. It was a large place, with tall stone walls topped by battlements on 3 sides. On the side opposite of the gate out was an additional gate that led inside of the main castle itself, the keep. The old gate had been removed by the Germans, and the vehicles they had were parked in the entryway, lined up and pointed outward, ready to be driven in case the Nazis ever needed to leave. From their position, it was a straight drive across the courtyard to the outer gate. The structure around the inner gate, which housed the vehicles, had been targeted by bombings, but the old castle was strong and resilient and didn't collapse, holding together as well as Roman concrete did. No one knew the layout of the inside, but the inner courtyard and outer walls had been photographed many times by planes. The whole structure was surrounded and guarded by walls and towers. Don't go inside the main section of the castle. That's where most of them are living, it seems. Or one of the cellars under it, anyway. Keep to the courtyard and outer walls if you can. Phillips and Bride were told by one of the soldiers in command who was briefing them. He took a cigarette out of his mouth. We're not exactly sure on the number of Nazis inside the castle, but they always patrol the outer walls in groups of 2, sometimes 3. They're never alone. But between the siege, harsh conditions, apparent suicides, and the skirmishes fought last year, we don't think there's any more than somewhere between 50 to 55 inside. Our last count based on photographs and different people, plus those suspected to be inside, came out to 54, but then one defected, so approximately 53, the British lieutenant said. We don't know that for sure. It could be more, the American lieutenant chimed in. They were also told not to approach the main gate when they attempted to make entrance, as it was always heavily guarded, and anything that moved near it, even a rabbit, was gunned down. They must have brought more ammunition when they joined up here. They haven't run out yet, and we've been besieging this place for a year, one of the lieutenants said to the 2 sailors. Food, too, a British counterpart added. They haven't run out of their stores either. They must be growing some stuff, or eating the rats, the American lieutenant interrupted, but his companion nodded approvingly. Yes, a shame they haven't caught the plague. It's also possible they have some cash there. The Nazis controlled this whole area from 1939 to 1945. They could have stored seeds or canned food here, and weapons for sure. Maybe even some of their loot. Phillips and Bride remained silent as they looked everything over. We don't know what you two, or rather whoever is sending you in, are hoping to achieve with this mission of yours, but don't approach to the cover of darkness. We've ordered weapons and ammunition to be made ready for you by the time you approach, the American lieutenant said, putting his cigarette in his mouth and puffing on it. Your best bet would be to climb the outer wall itself. It's cracked enough in one section that you should be able to do it. Try to do it between a patrol, but there's always duos on the walls at strategic points, so you might still be spotted once you're at the top, but it's your best bet. Anything else? Phillips said, with more snark than sarcasm. I love hearing good news. The lieutenant put his cigarette out and exhaled the last of the smoke from his mouth. Don't be an asshole, he said, with a polite smile that had nothing but the same energy as Phillips's attitude. Bride stepped in. Don't mind him. This just brought up some unpleasant memories for him. You should see what being out here for a year does to you, the lieutenant said, pulling out a stick of gum and popping it in his mouth. Lads, I'll show you where you can climb up, the British lieutenant spoke up, grabbing some binoculars from another soldier and motioning Phillips and Bride to follow him. He led them out of the tent they'd been briefed in and walked next to one of the tanks facing the castle. He put the binoculars to his eyes for a moment and then lowered them, passing them to Bride. See that section of the wall straight ahead? It's crumbling worse than some of the others. There'll be plenty of footholds for you both there to climb up. If we were ever ordered to scale the wall, that's where we'd do it. Bride nodded and passed the binoculars to Phillips. Thank you, he said. By the time the sun had set, Phillips and Bride had been given a rifle each. The sights are good, and you have plenty of ammo for each, the soldier who gave them to the sailor said as he passed them the guns. Here's a bag with extra clips and a small suture kit. Also, it looks like they're picking up their activity in there, so be careful, or you'll be hanging from the window like that poor soul who has been for the last year. The bones would still sway in the wind, held together by clothes and the few strings of rotten muscle that remained under them. He wasn't a poor soul, Bride said. He's the reason we're going in there. He gave the Nazis something we've been ordered to take back. That's all I'm allowed to say. Must be a big secret, the trooper replied. He sighed and took off his belt, with his sidearm and its holster on it, and passed it to Phillips. Here, just in case. It's fully loaded, and it never hurts to have a sidearm. Phillips nodded and took the weapon, sliding the belt over his right shoulder and draping it down across his chest, the pistol hanging over his stomach. Thanks, he said, taking the rifle from the trooper and making sure a bullet was in the chamber. Then he slid the weapon over his other shoulder and sighed. Here we go. They were both given a knife as well. He and Bride then went and sat by one of the tanks with some of the other troops on watch until the sun was fully set. Then they waited until the near full waxing moon went behind some clouds and then set off beyond the line into the field towards the castle. They started at a good pace, then slowed down as they neared the ancient walls. Then, by the time they came to the last few hundred yards, they ducked low and all but crawled the rest of the way, moving slow enough that they didn't cause so much as a twig to snap or the grass to rustle. As they crawled through the grass and brush, Bride suddenly put his hand on something sticky but smooth and jerked back when he saw it was a skull. A human skull without flesh, still attached to the rest of the body and lying in a tangled heap in a bush. It was a dead British paratrooper who still had a shredded parachute draped around him. Part of his weathered and tattered uniform was obviously shredded by a hail of bullets and not the elements, and his lower jaw was still open in a scream. "Fuck," he said under his breath, pulling his hand back. Phillips swallowed all the saliva in his mouth as he looked at the body. There had to be hundreds littering the area around them. He patted Bride on the back. "Come on, we're nearly there." They crawled on past the body and closed the rest of the distance to the wall. Once there, they froze for a few moments and then stood up, slinking close to the wall as they slowly made their way to the location where they could climb up. Both were now holding their rifles. All was silent as they reached the crumbling section, but not so crumbling that it wouldn't withstand bombs because the charred rock showed that it clearly had been targeted by either aircraft or the tanks. Here they paused again for a moment before slinging their rifles over their shoulders and climbing up. The rocks faintly crumbled around them, and then one suddenly slid loose under Phillips's foot and went tumbling down the wall towards the ground. The sailors halted and pressed themselves up against the wall, but nothing moved above them. "Let's go, Little John," Phillips said under his breath, beginning to climb. Bride exhaled the air he'd been holding in his lungs, and it kicked up a cloud of dust from the rocks into his face. "William, you're not Robin Hood. Don't act like it." "No, but Prince John might turn up if we don't keep moving," Phillips answered, climbing past Bride. Bride shook his head, but followed. Bruno was definitely joining them on this mission, it seemed. The wall was nearly sheer, and as the ground became further and further away below them, Bride suddenly found his non-fear of heights being tested. "The hell am I doing up here? There had to be a better way to accomplish this," he said to himself. More small pebbles were sent tumbling down with a soft crackling sound from each spot they climbed over. "God, I feel so exposed doing this," Bride said. "Just keep your head," Phillips replied. "Our allies are the ones behind us, and I still haven't seen anyone above us." As they climbed higher, the footholds, the protruding stones and cracks in the walls, became sparser, but not to the point they couldn't proceed. However, one protruding stone Phillips put his foot on suddenly slid free from under him and went crashing down the wall, striking other stones as it went. Phillips caught himself on the rocks he was grasping with his hands and held on, his legs swinging for a moment before he found other footholds to catch himself on. The stone, meanwhile, nearly struck Bride as it tumbled past him, but missed by only about a foot, and it went crashing down to the ground below. "Shit," Phillips hissed, going still and listening. "Why do the odd stones fall all the time?" Bride asked from below him, pressing himself against the wall. "Not good, or this place wouldn't still be standing," Phillips answered. He and Bride went still as statues and listened for a few minutes, but there was no sign of the patrol walking the walls having heard the noise. Phillips sighed after a few minutes passed, when his arms began throbbing from holding himself so tightly against the wall, and he relaxed his grip a bit. "Come on, we're about halfway there," he urged, continuing on. He and Bride continued to slowly pull themselves along higher before they again halted. They heard laughter above them and to the right. "There are people on watch," Bride whispered. Phillips nodded. "Yeah, come on. Slow, though." They continued to climb and soon pulled themselves up to the top of the battlements. Here they halted side by side for a few moments before making sure their footholds were good and strong and peeking over the top of the wall. To their right, maybe 5 long paces away, 2 German troops sat on the merlons, not even looking out at the encircling forces outside or along the walls. Their guns sat propped up nearby, but not in immediate reach for the two. They were talking with each other and laughing at nearly every word the other said, and it seemed like they might have taken something illicit. Phillips leaned over to Bride. "Hey, same deal as when we were in Poland a year ago. We need to look the part." Bride nodded. "Same old trick," he agreed, and slowly, the two pulled themselves up through the openings in the battlements and onto the walkway that ran along the top of the wall. They kept low as they did, and then silently crouch-walked towards the two German soldiers. The two were still laughing, now giggling, between themselves. They did not spot the two sailors as they crept up on them until Phillips grabbed the nearest one and stuck his knife up through the man's chin and into his skull. The other Nazi looked surprised, but the glazed-over look in his eyes did not turn to alarmed comprehension until just before he'd been grabbed by Bride. Bride covered his mouth to keep him from shouting and wrestled the soldier to the ground, squeezing him in a chokehold. The man fought back and started slapping the stones with his palm to try and attract the attention of someone else. Bride tightened the chokehold until the soldier stopped fighting and muttering, and then continued until he stopped gurgling and went silent. He did not want to risk getting blood all over the uniform he might have to wear. That would not help them blend in. Phillips hadn't taken his knife, which was stuck in all the way up to the hilt, out of the other soldier's chin for the same reason. Peeking down from the wall, they saw most of the troops inside the castle must have been gathered in the courtyard below. It was as busy as an ant hive. There were easily 30 of them down there, milling around several parked vehicles which were arranged in a line. They seemed to be organizing large boxes of supplies, but what they were loading into them the sailors couldn't make out. "Okay, something is definitely up," Bride said. Phillips nodded, lowering his soldier to the ground and taking their helmet off before moving to unbutton the dead man's shirt. "Yeah, Airmore said they were close to being ready. They may actually be about to try it," he said, as he lifted the man to take his shirt off. "We have to hurry," Bride said. The realization that the same technology that had unleashed the horrors they witnessed on the USS Eldridge was about to be used again here had made the danger feel very real. Either Arne Wolf's time travel plot was about to work, or it would go wrong like it had on the Eldridge and spiral all of these Nazis into an uncontrollable, depraved, homicidal rage they couldn't control. "Do you really think we have a chance of pulling this off?" he asked Phillips. "With them apparently being this close to trying whatever their plan is? I don't know. But listen, if we can't stop them from using it, then we play along until we have a chance to do so, no matter what happens to us because of it. Aaronmore's right. That technology being used as the weapon, or possibly getting out of here, is too dangerous. It has to be stopped." Bride nodded. "No matter what happens to us," he agreed, slipping on the helmet the trooper he had taken down had been wearing. Once they had fully disguised themselves, having to mix the uniform parts between the two of them to find articles that fit over their American uniforms, they heaved the bodies over the wall to hide them. They tumbled down into the gloom and landed on the rocks below with a crunching thud each. Then, they descended the near stairs down into the bailey where all the activity was happening. Everyone was busy and seemed to have a task, so no one looked their way for the time being, but the two did keep their heads down as they walked. The last thing they needed was someone looking over and realizing that they were strangers. "Keep an eye out for any masks or anything we can cover our faces with," Phillips whispered in German. He and Bride had both done as Aaronmore said and studied harder than they had ever studied anything before, even spending a few hours with a linguist before leaving Hawaii to have a crash course on getting the accent right. But speaking correctly and looking the part would do them no good if someone looked up and didn't recognize their faces. The last time they had done something like this, they at least had the benefit of mixing in with a bunch of other German soldiers who were gathering from all over. But these people had been held up behind these walls for a year now and would know everyone like the backs of their own hands. He and Bride pulled their helmets low as they proceeded through the crowd. As they jostled their way between the busy troops, Bride hissed under his breath to Phillips, "They said the vehicles are in the main part of the castle. That's got to be where the machinery will be." "Look what they're packing," Bride said a moment later. Several of the Nazis were packing shirts with long, tight sleeves, leggings, tunics, and other articles that looked very strange to the two in various large crates and loading them into the vehicles that had already been moved from the keep and out into the inner courtyard. Though none of these had the machinery packed into them that the two sailors were seeking. They doubted any of these did. They were luxury cars that German officers had used during the war. So, they continued to make their way towards the arch, where the inner gate to the keep would have been, when suddenly headlights inside the tunnel turned on and engines roared to life, and out drove a vehicle which had previously been sheltered. In its open bed was a large machine. It almost looked like a ship's engine, with large swiveling parts on the outside that were ring-shaped. From behind the vehicle, which drove around the outer walls until it was at the head of all the others, where it stopped, came several others that had already been loaded with crates. The vehicles parked at the end of the line and the engines were all turned off, and then the troops in the courtyard stopped what they were doing. From out of the inner gate, a man then came, almost looking out of place amongst the soldiers because he wasn't wearing a military uniform at all. He almost looked like a professor. That's him, Phillips thought, he and Bride momentarily forgetting to try and hide their faces as they just stared. Unlike Vorman, who strutted about with unbridled arrogance about himself, his back straight and nose up, Arne was almost the opposite. He stomped forward with determination, but did not outwardly flaunt how righteous he saw himself as, nor did he openly display any feeling or arrogance of superiority. He did not even look remotely intimidating. His blonde hair was straight, but his eyes, aside from showing piercing determination, were the eyes of someone always thinking. Aaron Moore was right. This was a man who was smart. Walking behind him was a Nazi colonel who closely resembled Vorman and walked in the same way he did. His back erect, his strides long, his uniform straight and neat, and his head raised. But it was not him who was receiving the salutes from the troops. It was Arne. As he passed them, the soldiers stopped what they were doing, stood up straight, put up their right arms with a shout of, "Hail victory!" Arne did not return any of the salutes. He seemed to be in intense focus. He began pointing and shouting out orders, and the activity returned at a full flurry. The ant hive had been stirred up, and Phillips and Bride knew instinctively that it had been stirred up for war. Around them, the soldiers ran to finish their tasks. The crates were being loaded into the backs of the vehicles, which were starting up, along with a shovel or two in each one, save for the lead vehicle. The troops who had been on watch on the walls were coming down into the courtyard, and the rest were grabbing their weapons and walking towards the vehicles. Then, in the jostling, Phillips and Bride were caught up with everyone else, but knew there was nothing they could do to stop it now. They would have to go along with the Nazis' plan until an opportunity came by to stop it. Whenever that was, because who knew where and when they were going to. And it wouldn't be just as simple as destroying the machine once they were at their destination. It wasn't even about them being trapped in whatever time Arne was going to, but they would then have to bide their time until they knew what the Nazis were going to do in that time so they could stop that from happening. Even if they destroyed the machinery as soon as they were there, the Nazis would kill them and still be able to achieve their goals, even if it meant they couldn't come back to 1946 and reap the rewards of their labor. They would have to wait until they could actively stop their plan before doing anything with the machinery. So playing the parts for now, they walked towards the convoy with everyone else, who seemed too caught up to even notice them. Arne never once looked at them. Phillips and Bride ended up climbing to the back seats of one of the vehicles near the center of the line. There were about 10 of them in total, all of which were just cars the German military used, mostly Opel Admirals. The lead vehicle, which Arne and the colonel were sitting in, was an open-topped Volkswagen Type 82 Kimberwagen, the same vehicle Vorman and his group of extremists had used when they tried to use Die Glocke, for a similar purpose that Arne was now doing with the technology from the Philadelphia experiment. Around the two sailors, the Nazis were shouting and making final preparations. At the head of the convoy was Arne and the colonel. Arne climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle and turned backwards in his seat, doing something with the machine in the back. Once he seemed satisfied, he nodded and gave a signal with his hands. In response, the other vehicle engines started up. Arne flipped a switch on the machine and nodded to the colonel in the driver's seat. He began driving, and the others followed in a line, driving towards the gate. Bride leaned forward, looking out of the windshield, wondering what on earth Arnie and the others were doing. Phillips was wondering the same. If they drove out of the gates, the tanks would blast them right away. Then, they could see a green glow beginning to come from the rings on the machine. And then, right in front of the outer gate, a greenish fog began to materialize, about as high and wide as the gate itself. The same greenish fog that had materialized around the USS Eldridge when she was turned invisible, and when she time traveled. Phillips and Bride looked at each other in silence, but their eyes were wide with fear. It was working, and they had no idea where they were going. The convoy drove straight towards the cloud, which began to spread out into an oval-shaped ring, and within that ring, a hole appeared to unzip in reality itself. It looked just like the hole that happened when the Deglaka was used. Space and reality itself was torn open and peeled back, and on the other side, Phillips and Bride could see daylight in a forest instead of the ruins of a castle at night. The convoy drove right through the opening, one at a time, and then once they were all through it, it closed behind them. Outside the castle, the troops encircling it were put on edge by the sudden sound of vehicles, but when none came through the gate and the sound stopped, they relaxed and didn't think anything of it. Phillips and Bride blinked as they passed through the fog, and suddenly, it was daylight outside. It was like a switch was flipped. The castle was gone too, and the terrain different, and there was a dense forest surrounding the convoy now. The vehicles drove through the hole in time in a line, but dispersed on the other side, parking in a scattered formation amidst the trees, and their engines were turned off. The Nazis immediately all began exiting the vehicles. Some started getting the crates out of the cars, others were pointing and shouting, and others were running around with their guns out, searching the area. Arne Wolf and the colonel, who was following him around like a dog on a leash, were already out of the Volkswagen by the time the car Phillips and Bride were in stopped. Arne motioned everyone to be silent as they climbed cautiously out of the vehicle, and the soldiers all immediately fell silent. Arne looked around the forest for a minute, but the only sounds were rustling, unseen animals and birds in the trees. Once he seemed satisfied they were unnoticed, he looked at everyone around him. "Wait here. I must make sure we are in the right spot." He would have to recalculate the machinery if he was wrong. Something accidentally time-traveling was one thing, but trying to use that same technology to navigate through time to a specific point was a completely different ballgame. However, Wolf did seem satisfied that the location was right. It was just the time he needed to confirm, and he could only do that with observation. "If we are in the right period, I will finally tell you all what we are going to do here. Your patience has been much appreciated, and soon it will be rewarded, gentlemen." What the Nazis did next caught Phillips and Bride off guard. They all raised their hand for their salute and shouted, almost cult-like, "Hail my leader!" The two had kept behind everyone else, and their lack of a salute thankfully went unnoticed, and they quickly hid the shocked expressions from their faces. "These guys are completely devout to this guy. They're calling him their Führer," Phillips thought. Now, he really wished he had a mask to cover his face, and he knew Bride felt the same way. The soldiers around them all stood at attention, and the two sailors did the same to not appear as conspicuous. Arnie scanned everyone's faces, and then curtly replied, "Glory to Germany." With that, he turned and walked into the trees at a quick pace. "Guard the vehicles. Arnie has given the order to kill anyone who comes by if they are obviously not anyone important. He doesn't believe anyone like that will. Not here," the colonel ordered, and then followed Arne into the foliage. Once they were gone, the troops dispersed a bit and milled around the clearing. Phillips and Bride slunk back and just tried to stay out of the way. They felt utterly powerless, but knew, at the moment, there was nothing they could do, and for the time being, they were essentially on a roller coaster, something that was ongoing, but they couldn't influence. They hated it. Arne and the colonel only walked a short distance through the forest before the trees thinned out. As the forest broke open, they were revealed to be on top of a hill, looking down at a harbor, and one of the vessels moored there, a particularly large ship, caught Arne's eyes. "That is the fishing village of Barfleur, Normandy," Arne said. He raised some binoculars to his eyes to look at the large ship in closer detail. He laughed a moment later. "There it is," he whispered. It was the exact ship he had hoped to see and was looking for. It was there. He had done it. They were in the right place and the right time. Arne lowered the binoculars and gazed down at the pier where the ship was anchored. His placid face slowly broke into a pleased smile because this was it. His ticket to undo the greatest defeat the world had ever seen and set things right. Put those who he knew deserved to be put in their places in them, and those who had crossed over the bridge at the top. When he was done here, their banners would hang in every country in the world, because here he could undo the defeat they had been dealt. The world would be on its knees before Nazi Germany when he was done here. He could not wait to see the world put as it should be, and those who he knew deserved to live, the only ones left. Perhaps, after he was done undoing Germany's defeat, he would even sit at the resolute desk, ruling over one of the many new satellite states in the name of the Führer, watching as new flags replaced the old ones. The 1946 he would find upon his return would be a very different one indeed, and he was excited to see it. Incredible how one little change to an all but forgotten incident from centuries ago can change so much, he said to the colonel standing next to him, before he turned and walked back to the rest of the group. Arne was very pleased when he returned to them and gathered them together. "I did it! We are in the right time and place. Hide the vehicles in the brush thoroughly and take out the disguises we have prepared and put them on." It was a good thing Phillips and Bride had worked so hard on learning their German. They understood everything and immediately set to work doing as Arne had ordered to blend in. As they helped cover one of the vehicles, they thought that Arne was giving them a look, but he was also looking at everyone as they worked. Phillips and Bride soon did the same, as many of the others were, taking leggings and tunics from one of the crates. There were also hoses in the crate that, when worn, came down to the knees on Bride and just above them on Phillips. They left their German soldier disguises on under, knowing they couldn't take it off and reveal their American uniforms under that. The military uniforms everyone else wore, meanwhile, were folded and placed into the crates, which were then loaded back into the cars. Suddenly, no one in the forest clearing looked like a Nazi soldier at all. One trooper, however, did leave his helmet on. He simply hid it under a large hat. Arne watched this all, and once everyone was ready, he smiled. He was the only one not in a disguise at all. "The time," he chuckled at the unintended pun, "has come. Gentlemen, we have arrived back through time nearly 1,000 years. It is currently late afternoon in November. We are currently in Normandy, near Barfleur, a place vessels often depart from when traveling to England from France. We are not taking a ship to England to kill a king or anything like that. Currently, at port in Barfleur, not far from here, is one such vessel. A very special ship. A ship that in around 6 hours will sink and take 300 people with her to the bottom of the English Channel. Or rather, it was going to sink and take around 300 people to the bottom of the English Channel. That is what we are going to change on this day, gentlemen. Once we are done, I will fill in the whole story for you. Now that we are here, I do not have time to explain it all to you. But for now, what you need to know are 3 things. Trust me. Follow my orders when I give them, as some things we do must be timed carefully. And that we are going to keep the vessel known as the White Ship from sinking. Why this particular ship that most, if not all of you, have never heard of, will be explained once we have succeeded, I assure you. And know also that it will assure our victory. I'm afraid time is currently pressing, or I would explain it, because we must intercept some certain individuals now. They will be at the port. I will lead the way. Leave your guns, save sidearms you can conceal, here. And bring the shovels and extra ammunition. Come now, we move out. Feeling powerless, like they were being strung along on a ride they couldn't control or have any sway in, it was like they were characters in a book they were reading, because Phillips and Bride found themselves marching with the Nazis through the forest. Both were carrying a shovel. They felt as helpless as they did the first time they saw the Deglaka tear open a hole in time. Until they could find a moment where they could interfere, helpless they would stay. Soon the coast came into view, as did a village and a port. At one pier, a large sailing vessel was moored. Arne stopped and looked down at it, and then at the people on the pier. The crew of the ship are now loading up wine. The heir to King Henry I of England has supplied a great amount of it for the voyage at the request of the nobles, who will be boarding the vessel later, Arne explained, turning around to face his men, who again stood at attention at being addressed. They did so with such programmed uniformity that it looked like cult members who were being addressed by who they thought was their messiah. It was very disturbing to see how fanatic they had become in the last year, if they weren't always like this. This is our only chance to interfere unnoticed. Since the crew all died when the white ship sank, their deaths now will not change anything. The crew consists of Captain Thomas Fitzstephen, one helmsman whose name has been lost, and around 50 or so sailors and oarsmen. Our numbers are perfect. Colonel Abel, you take 2 others and do not let anyone come down to the pier. You have all studied the local dialect as I ordered. Be sure you use it if you have to interact with anyone. There are also diseases that we will not have immunity to. Keep that in mind if you have to interact with anybody. No matter what, though, keep people away from the pier for the next half hour or so. 30 minutes should be enough. The rest of us? Put silencers on your pistols and come with me. He smiled, pulled out his sidearm from a concealed holster, and snapped a silencer onto it. Just go with what happens. Don't think. Just do as I say, he added. The colonel led 2 others away towards the village, and Arne approached the pier from the concealment of the tree line, which ran right down to the coast and to the pier. Trailing behind, Phillips and Bride slowly followed, feeling dread growing in their guts as they continued to be strung along, feeling helpless. It got to the point Phillips reached into his tunic to pull his pistol out, but Bride stopped him. Not yet, he hissed. They're going to kill them, Phillips shot back. I know, but we can't do anything right now. We have 1 pistol. Even if you get Arne, we're dead, and who knows if they'll stop. That colonel might know the plan too, Bride whispered. I hate it, but we can't stop them. Not yet. Phillips groaned softly, knowing Bride was right, and with a shaking hand, he released his grip on his pistol, leaving it hidden inside his tunic. I'm not shooting anyone, he said. He now knew what the shovel he was carrying was going to be used for, though. Boldly, Arne led the group out of the trees and onto the pier. There was no one around but the crew of the ship. The white ship itself was an impressive sailing vessel of large size. She had tall masts with large sails. With the overall shape of a Viking ship, she was massive, both her bow and stern ending at pointed ends. Her oak planks overlapped one another on the hull. The wood was a very pale color, hence the name of the ship. Tethered to the ship near the stern was a single smaller boat, looking like a lifeboat one would see on a passenger liner. As the crew were loading their cargo of wine on board, one man, who Phillips guessed was Captain Fitzstephen, paused at the sight of the crowd, approached them, and stepped forward to speak with Arne, who was a few paces ahead of everyone else. As they met, the main bulk of the Nazis halted, and Arne stepped forward to Fitzstephen. Everyone reached into their tunics and robes as Arne smiled at the captain. Hello, he greeted in the local dialect. Thomas Fitzstephen? Arne held out his hand. I am he, the captain confirmed and shook it. Are you seeking to arrange passage over the channel? Alas, if so, I must tell you my vessel is spoken for by the royal family themselves. I am seeking passage, and am taking your vessel from you. This is not a supplication, Arne replied, pulling his pistol out, raised it to the very confused captain's forehead, and pulled the trigger. The silenced bullet struck Fitzstephen before he could react or speak, and his body dropped like a stone in the water to the ground. The crew all stopped what they were doing and gasped in both alarm and confusion as the other Nazis stormed past Arne, pulled their guns out, and opened fire. Silenced gunshots popped, and the crew, who didn't understand what guns were or what was happening, didn't move as they watched their fellows being gunned down, utter confusion, overwhelming terror for a moment too long. One of the last crew on the pier put his hands up in a show of peace and tried to plead, but a Nazi just shot him in the face and he fell dead on the ground. While some stormed up onto the ship to make sure no one was on board, Arne approached the very last member of the crew on the pier, a young-looking man with strong arms, no doubt one of the oarsmen. "Danes! Devils! What deal have you made with him for such power?" he shouted, confusion and utter fear on his face as he saw the strange object strike his fellow crewmen down without touching them. Arne snorted with laughter. "No devilry, my friend. Germany has just declared war on you," he said. He raised his gun and shot the man between the eyes. He fell back into the water with a splash. Unconcerned, Arne slid the clip out of his pistol to check his bullet count before snapping it back in and then hiding his pistol away. "You would have died in hours anyway, and much more horrifically. Someone fish him out of there." He looked at the rest of the group. "The first shot was fired 800 years early. That must be some kind of record," he said. The others laughed. Someone said something about the early bird getting the worm and winning the war. Arne seemed to approve. He then ordered, "Those with shovels, go back to the forest, up a hill a bit, and start digging a large hole. The rest of us will bring the bodies. A few of you, meanwhile, get the rest of the cargo on board. Be quick. Those who are going to be on board will be arriving soon. King Henry's ship has already left for England. We are to follow in a few hours." He holstered his pistol and bent down over Captain Fitzstephen's body for a moment, before he took the man's clothes off and put them over his own, now disguised just like his men. He stood up. "We are the crew now. The crew who caused the White Ship to sink are now dead, and with us in their place, we will avoid their blunder and safely sail it to England." As they left the scene feeling sick, with a few others to go dig a mass grave in the woods, it, again, was like watching a car crash, or something else you couldn't stop but also couldn't look away from. Phillips choked down Vial and whispered, "I think I'm figuring it out." He waited until they found the spot and everyone was digging before continuing, speaking low to Bride. "We learned about this in my world history class in school. I haven't figured out why, but for whatever reason, they want to stop the sinking of the White Ship, and they're going to impersonate the crew to see to it that it doesn't sink." "Yeah, but why?" Bride said, plunging the blade of his shovel into the dirt. Philip shook his head and spat. "I don't know. I'm guessing he wants someone who died, maybe King Henry's heir, to survive? That's all I can guess. That would change things. How that benefits him, I can't guess." They didn't dare speak any more out of fear of the others overhearing them, and focused on digging, unwitting parts of Arne's sick plan, and soon the others began bringing the bodies into the forest and throwing them into the deepening hole. Soon, as the diggers continued to deepen and widen the hole, all of the bodies of the crew were dragged into the forest and tossed into the mass grave. It looked like a painting depicting the worst of the Black Death by the time the digging was done and the bodies were thrown inside the pit. Arne came back with the last of the bodies and nodded approvingly. "Good. Cover them," he ordered. "Even if archaeologists were to find this spot in a few hundred years, no one would ever know who they were. Though, they have been spared a worse fate than they would have originally had. Perhaps they're grateful in whatever afterlife they've found themselves in." He paused. Knowing in his own mind he thought of everything that could possibly happen as a result of his actions, but also how his actions would not affect history. These men were going to die anyway. Best to take them out and manufacture an explanation to satisfy history that would not cause unwanted changes later. And he had done so. Looking into the pit, Arne smirked as some sick joke went through his mind, and he began to recite an ancient written work. "The city was full of corpses. Moreover, the dead were honored with no tears or candles or funeral mourners. In fact, things had reached such a point that the people who died were cared for as we care for goats today. So many corpses would arrive in front of a church every day and at every hour that the amount of holy ground for burials was certainly insufficient for the ancient custom of giving each body its individual place. When all the graves were full, Huge trenches were dug in all of the cemeteries of the churches, and into them the new arrivals were dumped by the hundreds. And they were packed in there with dirt, one on top of the other, like a ship's cargo, until the trench was filled. Poetic. The words describe both now and the world we will return to, with bodies lying in mass graves or incinerators, Europe on fire, America submitted, and Japan and Italy, our puppets. Glory to Germany. Arne looked at the men with shovels. Bury them and come back to the ship. Our passengers are going to arrive soon. We sail at sundown. His men saluted as they left, and even though they had still, thankfully, amazingly gone unnoticed, Phillips and Bride still felt very exposed. These weren't just men following orders, like many had claimed they'd done so after the war ended, but they wholeheartedly believed everything Arne said to them. These weren't just soldiers following a leader. They were sheep, following a shepherd who had spent a year making promises that fueled their desires and were almost brainwashed with them. They didn't just act like a cult, they were one in every sense of the word. And now that they seemed so close to completing their goals, they were awake with fiery fanaticism, and even more extreme than the werewolf unit Vorman had used when he stole the Deglaka. So he could try a similar plan. And Arne himself. The two sailors had never seen anyone so unhinged and deranged before, masked under his calm demeanor and small stature. And all the while, as they filled the hole in and buried the bodies, Phillips and Bride still felt like they were helplessly watching a car crash with no ability to stop. How they would even have a moment now to interfere and finally act, they didn't know, until it suddenly hit Phillips. They had to make sure the white ship still sank and make sure everyone who was supposed to die in the sinking still died. It was the only way to save history in the modern world as they knew it. They had to kill all of those who were supposed to die. By the time they were done, the sun was sinking low. The sky was turning yellow, and shadows between the trees were lengthening. As they walked away from the mass grave, Phillips put a hand out, and he and Bride hung back. Once the Nazis were ahead of them, they ducked back out of sight and crouched behind a tree. After waiting for a moment to make sure they weren't seen, the two let out the breath they'd been holding in all day and sighed deeply. Taking a deep breath in, Phillips spoke first. "We have to stop them," he said softly, looking Bride in the eyes. Bride nodded but didn't speak. Phillips looked in the direction the others went. "We have to make sure that ship sinks. We touched on this story in my world history class as part of the anarchy. When the white ship sank, the heir of King Henry I died. I don't know why Arne wants to change that, but that has to be it. I can't think of anything else he would get from stopping the ship from sinking, or whoever else he would save that would be as important to altering history." He stopped and looked back at Bride. "John, I don't like it any more than you do, but we have to kill all those people who are going to get on that ship. It's the only way we can make sure history doesn't change. We have to make sure they die." Bride closed his eyes and shook his head. "I know. I don't know if I can stomach it. Killing the Nazis is one thing, but even though they're supposed to, I don't know if I can stomach this, because they did nothing." "I know," Phillips said, "but it is the only way. And it has to be us now that the crew of the ship are dead. If we don't do anything, the white ship won't strike that rock. Arne is going to sail that ship out of here and avoid the rock the ship struck. It struck the what was it called? The Quilbeof rock. It's a large rock that just sticks out of the water, almost egg-shaped. The teacher showed us a picture of it. It'd be impossible to see at night, and that's when she's gonna sail." "William, I just don't know if I can do it," Bride said. "I don't know if I have the stomach to do what we have to do. Killing innocents like this? The crew was bad enough and we didn't even do anything." "I know. We couldn't. But we can now. John, we don't. A lot more people are going to die. I know that doesn't justify sinking a ship with everyone on it, but because that ship did, history played out in a very specific way. We have to keep it that way, or who knows what damage it will do. Philip said, John, I truly learned what evil was in a person during our adventure with the Diglaka. Arne is something else. There's an evil I see in his eyes I've never seen in anyone else I've met. No one. We have to stop him. This whole adventure, more so since we got swept up in the convoy, I've felt hopeless. It's like we've been watching a catastrophe we know is coming, but we can't stop. Like the build-up to a car crash, we can't stop from happening. But we can't just keep watching. We'll have to act to stop it. He stood up and held a hand out to Bride. Bride looked up at him. He had the face of a very tired man, but then it turned to a determined one. He took Phillips's hand, and Phillips pulled him to his feet. Bride nodded to him. I know, is all he said. He could live with the memories after it was all done. For now, he and Phillips both had a job to do. They were going to keep history from changing. They were done being strung along like puppets on a string in a show they couldn't change the story of. It was time to interfere and stop the car crash by causing another one. They caught up to the rest of the group as they were nearing the edge of the forest and returning to the pier. The Nazis were talking and laughing amongst themselves and hadn't noticed the sailor's absence. Back at the pier, they found it crowded. The passengers, everyone they would have to see die, had arrived. William Adeline, heir of King Henry I, his half-sister Matilda Fitzroy, illegitimate brother Richard of Lincoln, more of the extended royal family and other family members of the royal government and royal household, many nobles of England, Richard de Bostock, nobles from Normandy, clergies, countesses, knights, and even family of the Emperor of Rome and many others. Many of the passengers were younger individuals too, all of whom had no idea the vessel they were boarding had been secretly commandeered with its crew replaced and impersonated by some of the evilest of men from over 800 years in the future. On the ship, the crew were placing and hanging lanterns to illuminate the deck. In the light, the wood did almost look ghostly white. Once they were on board, Phillips and Bride played along, now less worried about being noticed due to all the new faces around them. They helped the impersonators get the ship ready for launch. Other crew members were getting the sails and oars ready. Phillips had explained to Bride that the ship struck the Quilbayof rock almost immediately after leaving port, within a few miles, so they would have to be ready to act quickly once she was making sail. They would have to keep an eye out for it and act when they were in the right spot. They had to time their movements just right if they hoped to pull it off. Holy shit, Phillips said at one point, stopping what he was doing. Bride looked up. A well-dressed young man, he was only 17 years old, had boarded the ship, obviously of a high class, laughing with several others. That's him, Phillips said. William Adeline. Son of a bitch. He saw a very pleased Arne step forward and greet the heir of England. The sailors shook their heads and went back to helping make sure the ship was ready to sail as Arne ushered the heir onto the vessel. Around them, the nobles and royal court members were already heavily intoxicated, and the wine was already being opened. I wish we had version 2 with us here, Bride muttered to Phillips. Taking out these guys would be easy with him. He added, motioning to one of the crew members. As the ship neared the point of being able to set off, they saw a man come down to view the vessel with some later arrivals. That was the nephew of King Henry. Stephen of Blois, no doubt, as he did not board the ship, claiming to have changed his mind about going on board the ship due to a sudden sickness. It was a last-minute decision of his to leave the ship. A sudden stomach ailment saved his life. He'll survive the night and be one main cause of the anarchy, Phillips said to Bride as they looked down at him. The depictions Phillips had seen of him in class were not exactly accurate to life, but he knew that had to be the man because he was the only one who turned and, admittedly looking like he felt very ill, walked away without coming aboard the vessel. King Henry I had also been offered a place on the ship, but he'd made other arrangements and, likewise, would be spared the disaster. If one even still occurred like it was supposed to. How they were going to accomplish that, the two sailors still didn't know. If they failed to still make the ship strike the rock that sank it, maybe they could find another way to do so. Drop a lantern and set it on fire. If all those who were supposed to die still died, then did the cause of the sinking really matter in the grand scale of things? No one else really seemed to notice Stephen of Blois' departure because the nobles were now jostling and partying, downing tankard after tankard of wine. Though they couldn't understand the language being spoken, both Phillips and Bride could tell just how intoxicated some of the nobles were from how slurred or loud their speech or laughter was. The nobles around William were frolicking around the prince, toasting with refilled tankards and partying with, if possible, even more intense vigor than the sailors on Phillips and Bride's ship had done when they'd gotten the news that Hitler was dead, and then again later when they had heard Japan surrendered. The nobles also began insisting to their crew that they join in the fun, but, likely under Arne's instruction, they all politely refused. Unable to speak the local language when Phillips and Bride were pressed by the prince himself, who saw them standing near to him and hailed them with a wave, no doubt saying something along the line of, "Come, my friends, join in the fun," he had called in a loud, slurred but jovial voice. They'd simply shaken their heads and refused with smiles, and William moved on, putting an arm around another crewman and trying to force a tankard into his hands. Soon, the ship was ready to sail. The sails were lowered and some of the crew manned the oars, and there were a few left walking amongst the passengers keeping watch. Phillips and Bride among them, though they were now watching for the rock that was supposed to doom the ship. Though it was dark out now, and they knew it would be hard to see. "Live with it later," Bride reminded himself. "Live with it later. This is supposed to happen." Arne was at the helm, near a large tiller. At his side was Colonel Abel, who had been at the pier when Phillips and Bride returned, looking over the ship with a delighted, smug expression on his face. As Arne began steering the vessel out of port, the oarsmen propelling the vessel forward while Arne steered with the tiller, it only lit a brighter fire in the Colonel's eyes as their plan was now so close to succeeding. Phillips and Bride continued to mill about and try to go unnoticed amidst the crowd. As the night grew chillier to the point they could see their breath in the air. But as it turned out, the Nazis had not been fooled like they thought. As they were playing the role of crew, politely refusing any attempts from passengers to talk to them, and watching for any sign of the rock that the ship was supposed to hit, that was when two of the crew suddenly grabbed them from behind and restrained their arms. "Do not move," the bigger of the two men restraining them ordered in German. They forced the sailors to the stern, through the crowd without drawing attention to themselves. The partying crowd, reveling amongst themselves, drinking and talking, did not notice anything. Any who started to look at what was going on were distracted by one of the crew who shared a drink with them. So, Phillips and Bride, struggling with the men restraining them, were marched to the stern where Arne was waiting for them at the ship's tiller. Once they were brought before him and held there, their arms pinned behind their backs by the two men holding them, Colonel Abel looked like he wanted to step forward. His smile was gone and replaced with a sneer, but Arne held out a hand and stopped him. "I noticed you two in those final moments in the courtyard, almost immediately. They say war bonds soldiers stronger than even blood, and having spent a year with these fine men inside the castle, I noticed two strangers immediately, even if many of the others were too busy with their task to do so beyond the unconscious level. Once I saw you, I quietly ordered Abel here to pass along my order that you were not to be shot or otherwise hindered until I said. 'Let them come along,' I said. 'Let them see this. More than anyone else, they deserve to.'" Arne stepped forward to them. "Welcome, gentlemen, to 1120 AD, he politely greeted. Then he added, his voice a mix of excited and smug, "Or should I say, welcome, William Phillips and John Bride, key witnesses to the aftermath of the Philadelphia experiment, or Operation Happy Easter, on October 28th, 1943 AD, to November 25th, 1120 AD. At their stunned reaction, he smiled and said, "Yes, I know all about you two. My informant who gave me the information of the machinery that made the experiment possible gave me all the information about the event as well, including information on you two. I read all about you and what you saw that day, and I knew it was you two the second I saw you in the castle, but decided to play act as if I was oblivious for a time. I wanted to see what your game was, why your government sent you two in the place of an army. Was it because you understand the potential of the technology more than anyone else? Because it's a secret they desperately want to keep hidden? I must say, they were much less careful about this one than they were their atomic bombs. And yes, I know about that too. We were not blind in that castle. It was a secret command post in the war, and listening equipment was still inside and functional. Though, I will admit, I did not expect you two to turn up. Your government hid that well enough, but I was very happy to see you. Who else more deserves to see the same technology that horribly malfunctioned used to its full potential than you two? He was now speaking to them almost like how a fan would greet their favorite motion picture actor or novelist. Neither Phillips or Bride answered for a moment, and the soldiers holding them did not release them. Phillips shook his head and looked over at Bride. This guy really is as insane as Vorman was. He didn't care if Arnie, who now looked amused, heard him or not, and then he faced Arnie directly and added, Your plan is going to end as poorly as his did. I hope you know that. He tried the same thing and ended up torn in half because of it. Arnie smirked and barely restrained a chuckle. He patted the ship's tiller, then stepped away from the helm and paced for a moment, placing the ship momentarily under the guidance of his host of rowing men. We can talk about Herman Vorman in good time. We knew each other well because we were both involved in the development of the Bell. Arne stepped forward and down from the helm so that he was almost nose to nose with Phillips and Bride. Their eyes were at equal heights. He was looking at them as equals. What do you know of this ship? He asked and waited, his expression placid and ignoring the glares he was getting from the two sailors. Only what William has told me, Bride eventually said. Arne nodded and looked expectantly at Phillips. Just what I learned in world history. This was essentially the prologue to our lesson on the anarchy, he explained, just giving Arnie what he wanted for now. The man seemed excited to have them on board, and for now it was best to just keep him happy. Arne smiled and clapped his hands together approvingly. Very good, he congratulated. And do you know who happens to be on this ship that we are in the presence of, even now? William Adeline, Phillips answered. Arne nodded. And the name of the ship? The White Ship, Bride said. Arne seemed happy with their answers. Yes, sunk on this day in this year, or at least was. According to most accounts, when it sank, only a butcher named Berold survived the disaster. However, I did discover a long-lost medieval manuscript in an archive that mentioned two other unknowns who survived the sinking. It is unknown who they were, but most certainly none of the nobles or royal family members, or it would have been documented. Perhaps, like Berold, people on board to collect overdue payments? Whoever they were, history seems to have forgotten them. They're not mentioned in any other source on the disaster I've ever read. Perhaps they didn't exist and it was an error. Stories get embellished with time. I personally have doubts that Thomas Fitzstephen, provided he wasn't indisposed of, really did allow himself to drown after hearing of William's death. Seemed too much like a melodrama. Probably was exaggerated and a detail added sometime in later centuries. Added as an enhancement. Among those who died, however, and no manuscript or historical work challenges this, and I spoiled it a moment ago, was the heir to the throne of England. That is why I chose this moment. I imagine you two might have figured that out? You don't want William to die, Phillips spitefully muttered. Why else would you choose a random disaster from 800 years ago, he asked. 825, yes. I thought you might have figured out that much, Arnie congratulated. But what I'm sure you want to know is, why? He took their silence as a prompt to continue and began to pace as he explained his reasoning to them. It was, again, like a fan explaining something to someone they greatly admired, or like a dog almost seeking its master's approval. I've studied the medieval histories. In the war, I tracked down many ancient texts in archives or in museums, read many accounts, modern and ancient, on this event and everything that happened after it and how those in power reacted to those events. Some even as recent as the First World War. And have determined that, with a different line of kings made possible with the survival of the heir of King Henry I, centuries from now, Britain will fracture. And by the time of our conquest, there will not be a united Britain standing in our way, and the world will fall to its new masters without them holding us back. Even with his heir, William, alive at the time of King Henry's death, it will not be a peaceful transition. The anarchy will still happen and be made even worse for England, as it will fracture into 3 divided states. This will cause them to begin losing hold and influence over the next centuries. Then the plague will come. Their wars with Spain and Napoleon will come. Their power will slowly diminish until by the 20th century they are merely divided states and not one unified, powerful force. Arnie sighed, almost dreamily, almost like he was aroused at the idea of it all. Of it all burning, and him walking through the ruins of everything. He turned back to Phillips and Bride like someone waking from a dream. The bell could have made it possible, of course. Vorman had the right idea when he wanted to use it, but he didn't look at the wider picture. He was convinced the war could be won by stopping your invasion of Europe. I tried to tell him otherwise the last time we spoke a year ago now. Vorman's gaze was locked on a specific point, and it kept him from being able to see anything around him. He paused and noticed Phillips and Bride looked confused now. Arnie sighed and said, "Tunnel vision." Vorman's fanaticism-fueled tunnel vision was locked on one specific thing he was convinced needed to be changed. He thought something in the war being changed would achieve victory, and no one could tell him otherwise. And it kept him from being able to take a step back and look at the wider view of history with an unbiased view, which I have done. With the Glocka gone, captured by the Allies, I believe, more so now that I hear you two witnessed his apparently gruesome death, when I know he was planning to retrieve the machine last we spoke, I had to borrow something in return for my attempt. Vorman was wrong about what needed to be changed. Changing something much further back in history is key. This moment here, allowing a different king to be crowned in some 15 years' time, will result in a crippling butterfly effect that plays out over centuries. And all my research has led me to decide that preventing the disaster which befell this ship is key. If this ship remains afloat, England will fall. There will be civil wars, strife, coming pandemics, and wars handled by different leaders that all shape how a new history plays out. And perhaps it will even prevent the United States, a colony under a different empire, perhaps the French, from breaking free in the 18th century and turning into a world superpower if they have to fight a different king entirely. Throughout all of that calamity in Europe, Germany will remain stable and grow in power, into a strong empire even. So finally come the war, it will prevail. It is ironic that the United States, in trying to make a bane to Germany, instead inadvertently created something with the power to let it win. Arne's own fanatic insanity was creeping out the longer he went on, and he wasn't done yet. He was now at the apex of his speech. No longer even looking at his guests, he stared off into the dark sky as he continued, an insanity-driven fire burning in his eyes. It is destiny that has brought us all here to this day, gentlemen. After reading about your experience on the Eldridge, I knew we would meet eventually. Something made it inevitable. Our destinies have brought us all here to this night over 800 years ago. That is fate, not random chance. He looked at them, smiling, his eyes still alight with fire. This obscure little moment from history, 220 years before the Black Death, 362 years before Christopher Columbus would sail on his great voyage. This moment that no one cares to remember in the 20th century is the one that will change so much. Amazing how such a far-off, seemingly little tragedy no one remembers from nearly 826 years ago can alter so much if it never played out, isn't it? You never think about the little things that shaped history in the largest ways. It's humbling. No? He finished, looking at the two again, looking excited for their reaction. You are insane, Philip said. Bride jerked, like he'd been shot. No doubt he expected to be, but Arnie didn't look like he'd been kicked. He laughed. Am I? Because I understand the potential of the technology? That I allowed you to live to see this moment because you understand more than anyone? I could have had you both thrown out of a window like I did my informant who made it all possible. No, William, my friend, you are wrong. I am enlightened, and soon you will see it. When the ship doesn't sink, we will return to the present and you will see it. Now Phillips and Bride both began to grow more fearful. They knew they were running out of time and had no way to make the ship crash at the present. Phillips just did the first thing he thought of. He started ranting, trying to put some doubt in Arnie that might make him second-guess himself. What about the fact that now everyone will think the crew are still alive? When you all vanish back to the future, won't that cause problems? Here's the ship, but where's the crew? He said. Arnie laughed. No. You see, once the heir is safely back in England, I intend to make this ship disappear. We'll sink her in the channel somewhere, close enough to land that we can all be ferried to shore in groups on the one lifeboat before we do so. Then we'll make her crash into a rock, burn her, something. Everyone will assume the crew went down with it when it disappears. Sunk. Perhaps even taken by some sea serpent that swallowed it in one bite. He shook his head and chuckled, as if amused by the ignorance many commoners had in the 12th century. Perhaps it was. It is a well-known legend that the ship was not blessed by priests before we left port, and one I can confirm because I saw our passengers drive them away when they came to do so. So, a great sea serpent devouring it seems fitting. You're not going to trip me up now that I'm here. I have been thinking about possible flaws in this plan for more than mere hours like you. I've thought about all of it for a year now. The beginnings of this go back further to when Deglaka was first put forth as an idea. Of course, everyone can make mistakes. If I did, well, I still have the technology your government funded to try again. But it doesn't matter. What matters is now. Gentlemen, don't you understand? It's destiny that brought us here tonight. You get to see this, the technology that unleashed so much horror, finally perfected and used. Surely you two can appreciate that. Phillips laughed at him. You say you're what Vorman could have been, but you're just like him. You're too caught up in your own brilliance. You think you've got the right idea, that you've created a perfect plan, but your head is too far up your own ass for you to even think you've overlooked something. No one is perfect. What if you erase yourself doing this? I'm telling you, Arnie, you have missed something somewhere. Some tiny detail is going to come back and bite you. How about the fact that we still have records in the modern day of this ship sinking? If you succeeded in doing this, those records wouldn't exist. Arnie simply shook his head and dismissed the notion, though Abel seemed, for just a moment, to have a flicker of doubt pass through him. You can't cause a butterfly effect, Arnie! It's a loop! The records still existing prove it! History played out like it already did proves it! Deglaka proved it! Things are going to happen as they always did! We can't affect it! Vorman was always going to die when he did. He couldn't have changed anything because D-Day originally succeeded. That means he can't undo it. And neither can you, because that's not how it works. It's a loop. Everything that has happened is always going to happen, and Deglaka itself proves you wrong. When Vorman tried to use it, we attacked him, and by accident we were thrown into the future. And we know from that your plan doesn't work. We would have seen it, but it didn't work. 100 years after the war, there is no civilization. You're wrong. This ship is still going to sink. You're not going to change anything. He was shouting now. The soldier holding him hissed, "Be quiet," in German. Most of the parting passengers didn't even notice amidst the racket they were making, but some glanced toward him due to the raised voices, so intoxicated that they didn't even register the fact the language was not one they could understand. A moment later, they went back to partying, the odd incident forgotten. Arnie was no longer smiling. He was scowling. He shook his head and took a step backwards, up onto the helm so that he was now looking down at the two sailors. He seemed sad. No, rather he seemed disappointed. He looked like someone who had met their favorite actor or novelist, and they did not match up to what they had imagined in their head. He shook his head. Sadly, you two have not lived up to what I hoped. You can't see it. I thought that if there was anyone out there who could, it would be you. The key witnesses to the original experiment. It's why I allowed you to see all of this up to now, but you're like everyone else. I let you live so you could see what could be. You could see that horror fulfilled in a meaningful way. But you can't see it. He was seething now, raging. You think any of these lads would have followed me this far if I told them what my plan was before I got here? No. And you two see no different. You can't see it. You think I'm mad as well. So be it. He grabbed the tiller again and turned to his right-hand man. Colonel Abel, you and these 2 lads holding them, take them behind me to the stern of the ship, tie their hands behind their backs, and throw them overboard. And do it quietly. A hand was placed over Phillips and Bride's mouths, and they were dragged behind Arnie towards the stern, struggling and kicking the whole while. Arnie didn't look at them again. He just stood at the tiller, facing forward. They were dragged by the 3 soldiers to the pointed stern of the ship, and as Abel tried to grab his hands and tie them, Phillips suddenly slammed his head back and smashed the colonel in the nose. He stumbled with a grunt, and Phillips tore free from the slightly surprised soldier who was holding him, shoved the one holding Bride to the deck, and sprinted past Arnie back into the crowd, and vanished. Kill them, Arnie ordered to Abel, who was back on his feet. And do it quietly. Do not make a disturbance. I will not risk my hard work being undone now at the 11th hour. Pass the word to the lads patrolling the deck. Grab them, and do not disturb the passengers. Abel and the 2 who had been holding Phillips and Bride hurried into the crowd, immediately being urged to share in the drinking and fun, and having to remain in character and politely refuse lost them precious seconds. Phillips and Bride had already melted into the crowd of faces and were nowhere to be seen. Abel shared the order with several other crew, and they fanned out to search the large deck in a way that simply looked like they were making sure all was well. 2 went below to search the low-ceilinged hold for the 2 sailors. Phillips and Bride, however, had split up from one another, and they were easing their way through the crowd, keeping the passengers between them and any of the Nazis they saw. The passengers around them were now far too intoxicated to even notice what was going on. Bride was holding his knife discreetly, hidden in his sleeve, as he met eyes with a glaring, largely built Nazi. The man started to ease his way through the crowd towards him, and Bride backed up, slipping past a few ladies and out of sight of the man. The big man tried to spot where the sailor went, but he was intercepted by 2 stumbling knights, holding refilled tankards who jovially grabbed the man and dragged him into their merriment and refused to let him walk away. Phillips, meanwhile, spotted a man keeping pace with him. They were separated by about 3 or 4 rows of jostling passengers who clinked their tankards together. They were walking towards the bow, and the crowd was thinning out, and the man was slinking towards him. Phillips made like he was doing the same, and, as they were about to meet, there was only one mast in the center of the deck between them. Phillips stopped when he was out of sight and slipped backwards around it to where the man had been right as he came around to where Phillips had been. He looked around but did not spot the sailor and, with a frustrated growl, slipped back into the partying crowd. One noble shoved a filled tankard into his large hands and refused to let the man pass until he partook in the merrymaking. The passengers were now actively, all but forcing the crew to partake. None of the men rowing stopped, though, even as Phillips and Bride walked right past them, if they even knew the 2 were being hunted now. Phillips and Bride kept moving through the crowd, keeping out of sight as they spotted more members of the crew looking for them amidst the passengers. Meanwhile, many of the now heavily intoxicated nobles began shouting at Arnie and the men rowing, "Faster! Swifter than an arrow! Let us fly and overtake the king's ship! Let him see what a fantastic voyage he passed on! You say this ship is swift? Show us, good captain!" Arne Wolf placed both hands on the tiller and held it tightly. He smiled kindly at them, or rather, he smiled like a condescending parent would to a young child who didn't know better, and said, "Not just yet, as soon as we are in open water." Despite this promise, and the dangerous rocks and the still shallow water around them, the passengers were too drunk to care. They kept it up and continuously pressured Fitzstephen to go faster, even offering his oarsmen all the drinks they would want if they would do so. Arnie ignored it and kept his eye ahead, looking for the passage out into the English Channel. Meanwhile, some of his crew pretended to pick up speed to get the passengers off their backs. He waved one of his men over and discreetly put a radio he had hidden under his disguise into the man's hand. "Keep this out of sight, I have another one. Go to the front of the ship and tell me if you see anything ahead. We are close to where the white ship would have struck the rock, and there are more around here." Meanwhile, Phillips and Bride both ended up near the bow on the port side by random chance. They paused for a moment, despite the fact the Nazis were still hiding among the crowd and hunting for them. Only 3 passengers were between them, and they both leaned against the side railing of the ship. Bride turned and glanced out into the water and saw something. And almost instinctively, he knew what it was from Phillips's earlier description of it. "William!" he shouted, looking over at his friend and pointing. Phillips saw what Bride was pointing at, the vaguely egg-shaped Twilbeuf rock. the top of which was just barely out of the water, only visible because of the waves lapping against it. Phillips slapped the side of the railing of the ship and swore, but a look came into his eyes that Bride had never seen before. Phillips, seeing the rock, suddenly felt it hit him. This was their last chance, so he threw caution to the wayside. If the ship missed that rock, it would all be over. He turned and shoved his way through the crowd at a sprint. Bride followed. Several of the Germans pointed, shouted, and followed by shoving their way through the crowd, but now the passengers were starting to angrily shout at them in return. Phillips emerged from the crowd at the stern to Arne's visible shock. He sprinted to the tiller, Bride right behind him, grabbed and threw Arne to the ground. Colonel Abel was still among the Nazis trying to hunt them amid the passengers and could not reach Arne in time. Despite trying, the colonel's path was blocked by the passengers. Phillips grabbed the tiller and pulled it with all his strength. The ship sharply veered, the rowing crew were knocked sideways, and many of the drunken nobles stumbled from the sudden motion. The bow sliced through the water, cutting waves into the surface as the ship turned and raced toward the rock on its own momentum. Then there was a shaking as the ship's port side bow smashed into the rock. The wood was crushed and torn open in a large gash below the waterline. Inside the low-ceiling hold in the bow, the two crew, who were looking for the stowaways below, suddenly saw the wall be torn open and smashed in, and a torrent of water rush in. The flood swept them up, and they were knocked off their feet and swept away, roaring so loud that their screams were hardly audible before they were cut off, as the water flooded the room, throwing cargo in barrels toward the starboard side. The intoxicated nobles now all fell onto the deck as the ship shook from the crash. Everyone was thrown from their feet in the crash. Phillips and Bride were up again well before the confused nobles were, and so was Arne, who slowly stood up and looked around, shaking his head, looking like he couldn't believe it. He looked at Phillips and Bride with a distant stare of disbelief, the expression on his face looking like he had a broken heart. He was in grief that his brilliant plan was now a car crash around him. Now he was the one powerless to stop it. "What have you done?" he asked. Phillips didn't answer. He just slipped his hand under his clothes, pulled out his pistol that the soldier had given him before they entered the castle, and fired several bullets into Arne. Arne stumbled back, the bullets knocking the wind out of him, and he let out a strained gasp as he tried to pull a breath in. The round struck him in the chest and stomach, and he found it hard to get any air into his lungs at all. His long blonde hair was no longer straight, but was now dangling disheveled in his eyes. Sweat broke out on his face, and he felt numbness strike him like a bolt. In the chaos beginning to unfold around them, no one was sober enough to even notice the gunshots. As Arne stumbled back against the port side railing, still gasping for air, Phillips slid his gun back into his concealed holster, stomped forward, and grabbed the Nazi, turned him around to face the sea, and threw him over the side. Arne's legs struck the side railing, and he fell headfirst, tumbling in a spiral over the side. With a strained scream, Arne fell out of sight into the dark water. As he turned back to face Bride, Phillips saw one of the nobles was looking at him with an utterly confused expression on his face, lost at what he had just seen. Phillips ignored him and hurried back to Bride. At this point, it didn't matter if they saw anything, because none of the nobles survived the sinking, so that man would never be able to talk about the strange, perhaps magical weapon he had just witnessed. Unless Phillips's world history class was wrong about the number of people who survived. He couldn't worry about Arne's comments on two other possible survivors now. He had to take a chance that they, if they existed, didn't see anything, or that they wouldn't be believed if they did. He grabbed Bride. They could feel the deck starting to tilt below them towards the port side. "We have to go," he said. Bride nodded. The ship was starting to take a sharp list to port below them as they looked away from the helm and into the confused chaos that was beginning to break out on the ship now that the drunk passengers slowly realized what was happening. "Oh God," Bride said. Not about the fact that everyone was about to die. As morbid as it was, for history to not be changed, that still had to happen. But because he realized that now he and Phillips had to survive the disaster themselves. Phillips seemed to grasp that fact at the same time because he muttered, "Shit." He grabbed Bride's wrist, pulling him into the jostling, confused, and panicked crowd. He stopped right away. "Wait, get out of these things. They'll get waterlogged fast." He and Bride stopped and instantly began tearing off their period disguises, and then the German uniforms under those, leaving them in their American uniforms. Of course, at this point, no one was paying attention to what they were wearing, because the passengers were all now realizing the ship was sinking. Happy shouts had turned to panicked ones, and several people leapt over the side into the water. Meanwhile, the ship was gaining a more and more severe list to the port side. Once they were out of their disguises, Phillips and Bride both ran to the port side as well. Just before they could push their way through the crowd to the railing, a hand suddenly grabbed Phillips's shoulder. He turned and saw Colonel Abel had a hold of him, his face looking like a rabid wolf. He raised a knife over his shoulder to stab the sailor, but before he could, or Phillips could react, Bride had come back and delivered a solid punch straight to the colonel's face. Both sailors heard his nose pop. Abel stumbled back, eyes rolling back into his head, and fell backwards onto the deck. The two left him and hurried to the port side of the ship and looked over the side out into the dark water below. They looked back at the chaos beginning to unfold around them. Meanwhile, the ship was still listing more and more onto her side. The sinking ship was now the most pressing danger. "Shit," Philip said again, whipping around to face his friend, remembering what his teacher had said shortly after the ship struck the rock. The ever sharper tilt of the deck was a telltale sign. "We have to get off the ship before it capsizes. We're not far from land. When you hit the water, start swimming away from the ship at once like we were taught in training. Don't try to grab onto any wreckage. Just swim for land." Phillips paused, and he and Bride shared a look, momentarily forgetting what was happening. They knew this might be the last time they would ever speak to each other. Phillips held out a hand to his best friend, and Bride took it. They shook hands. "Good luck," Phillips said. Bride nodded. "You too," he replied. "Don't stop swimming once you're in the water," Phillips said. Then, Bride watched as Phillips climbed up onto the railing, grabbed a loose rope trailing down from the mast above, and swung out into the darkness. He let go, there was a splash, and he was gone. Meanwhile, as the deck continued to gain a steeper slant, the especially inebriated people were starting to lose their footing and slide down the deck. Bride climbed up onto the railing, hesitated for just a moment, and then jumped. He hit the water quickly and sank deep into it. For a moment, the shock froze him. Then he recovered and began kicking through the utter blackness back towards the surface. The water was icy cold. It felt like being shot with 1,000 bullets all over your whole body at once. And when Bride's head broke through the surface, he did so with a scream of pain. The cold sucked all the air out of his lungs, and it was hard to suck any back in. It felt like the wind was knocked out of him due to a mix of burning and icy pain. He shook the water dripping from his hair into his eyes away with a shake of his head and began swimming in the direction he knew land was. He hoped the shore was not far, like Phillips said, and that he wouldn't be torn to shreds by the sharp rocks. Behind him, the ship, still visible due to all the lanterns burning, was not only sharply listing to the port side, but she was also going down by the head noticeably too. Her bow was visibly slipping lower into the water now. The water at the foremost point was starting to slosh over onto the deck. Many of the intoxicated passengers saw it and were shouting, beginning to stumble back. At the same time, the white ship, which had still been wedged against the rock, slid off with a sudden jostle that caused many clinging to her to fall. And with nothing supporting her, she began to quickly plunge down by the bow. It wasn't a sea serpent that was going to swallow the ship, but instead the icy water of the English Channel. William Adeline, meanwhile, was seized and hurried to the lifeboat by his somewhat still sober guards and ushered inside of it. Some of the crew had been trying to take it for themselves, but William's guards pushed them aside and threw them into the water. Many of the passengers rushed for the boat once the king's son was inside it, and as his guards moved back. Many jumped in, and others got knocked into it. By the time it was lowered by William's guards into the water and floating away from the ship, it was dangerously overcrowded. By now, total panic had taken hold over all those on board. Screams were piercing the night air where laughter had been doing so not even 5 minutes before. The white ship's bow sank below the surface. The water gushed up from the entrance to the hold like blood oozing out of a wound. Many, having nowhere else to go, either jumped, but most rushed for the stern of the ship. Bride didn't look back. He didn't know where Phillips was, but he knew he couldn't go looking. If he did, he'd freeze to death or drown. His limbs were already getting tired from the cold, and he had no idea how far he still had to go to shore. With a strained groan, the white ship lurched and, just as Phillips said it would, began to roll over. Drunk nobles, royal family members, and imposter crew members were clinging to her deck as the water gushed over it and were being washed overboard as the ship slipped deeper under the water. Lanterns began to be extinguished by the water, and darkness began falling over the scene as more of the ship sank. As she continued to roll, more and more people were thrown from the deck and into the gurgling, churning water of the English Channel. Many began swimming in all directions. Others treaded water. Others still made for debris that were breaking free from the ship or washing off of it that they could float on. Others were swimming back to the ship for whatever false safety it brought. Some who went into the water simply did not resurface. On the ship's deck, a barely conscious Colonel Abel felt himself sliding. His eyes shot open, and with a shout, he slid down the deck, knocking many of the passengers on the way and into the churning water. He splashed and grabbed onto the railing of the ship and tried to climb up with a shout. But then the piece he was clinging to went down, and the colonel was swallowed by the water as it splashed over his shoulders and then his head. He did not resurface. All the while, amid the screams and chaos of more people falling and being swept into the water, the white ship continued to roll over onto her port side. The ship's mast crashed into the water with a calamitous splash, crushing several swimmers. Others became trapped under the sails. Those being thrown into the water by the capsizing vessel clung desperately to the ship, too drunk to swim coherently. Their long and thick clothes became thick and heavy in the water, and many slipped below the surface as the ship continued to slip deeper into the water. Some tried to climb up, but the water caught up to them and was soon around them again. Others, who were still clinging to the ship, still above the water, began losing their grip and falling into it. The white ship was now fully on her side, settling down bow first, her stern rising out of the water. Her rudder was visible above the water's surface now. As she slid deeper into the water, people were still clinging to the ship in desperation as she slid deeper, hanging on even as the water rose up around them. But due to the sheer angle she rolled onto, many lost their grip and fell. Then, amid the calamity, and as his lifeboat rowed away from the sinking ship, William suddenly paused and looked back. He heard his sister's voice from the ship, pleading for help. Turning around in his boat, he scanned the scene, the sinking, people fighting and floundering in the water. Then he spotted her, his dear sister, Matilda Fitzroy, visible in the light from some of the few lanterns on the ship that were still above the water, standing amid the crowd on board the sinking ship. Then she was knocked from behind, over the side, and into the water, where she began struggling, barely staying above the water long enough to shout for help. William gave a cry and slammed his fist onto the side of the boat. "Turn back!" he ordered. Many in the overloaded boat looked horrified and did not react at first. Seeing this, and his sister slip under the water, William spun around and shouted, "Turn back, or I'll have all of you locked in my father's dungeon until you die!" He spun around and gazed at where she had been, but only ripples were there now, and her fingers as they still desperately broke through the surface. William stood up and firmly pointed, "Go back! In the name of God Almighty, row this boat!" Finally, the terrified-looking occupants, instead of escaping, began rowing the boat back towards the white ship and the crowded spot around her where everyone had been dunked off the ship. The little boat was jostled as it made its way through the torrent of splashes and people grabbing it, but the occupants pushed everyone off and dashed on through the crowd to Matilda. She had gotten her head above the surface again with a sputter and saw William extend his hand out to her, and she reached out for him. At that moment, the boat was swamped again by the panicked swimmers, and also by people who jumped from the sinking ship, which they were nearly alongside of, onto it. And as a result, it overturned, throwing all those in it into the water. Their dinghy capsized, and those all on board were buried in the deep. William did not resurface, and neither did Matilda once her hand slipped down again. Many passengers, meanwhile, tried to cling to the little boat, but it soon sank and left them all treading water, and between their clothes becoming heavy and waterlogged, and the cold sapping the energy from their limbs, many simply slipped down out of sight and never came up again. Meanwhile, on the sinking ship itself, as the final lanterns were extinguished by the water and the ship was plunged into total darkness, a few of the crew were still clinging on at the stern. One of them, as a terrified noble grabbed them to keep from falling off, shouted, "Get off!" in modern German, forgetting to speak in the correct dialect, but the scared man didn't seem to notice, but he also didn't understand. In a fury, the Nazi reached under his clothes and pulled out his concealed pistol and shouted again, "Get off!" When the noble still didn't, just looked in mild confusion at the gun, the man fired. He shot the man in the face and they tumbled back into the water. In a panic, the Nazi began shooting wildly, even at his fellow men, shouting, "Get off! Get away!" Several of the passengers fell into the water with bullet holes in their body, and so did several of the Nazis. A few other troops then pulled out their pistols and started shooting back at their fellow, and he returned fire on them. He shot several others until finally one shot him and, with a gasp, he dropped the pistol and slid down into the water. Then, moments later, the white ship went down, her stern sliding down into the water with an elegant dive, and she was gone. There was a final roar from the water as it sloshed and consumed the last of the ship, and a final tearing blast as the last of the air seeped out of her. And then, all that was left was the screams. The screams all died away soon after. The few people who were clinging to the debris all followed shortly. Come midnight, only one man was left alive amid the debris, clinging to a mast of the ship that had broken off from her, either during the sinking or immediately after. None of the crew were left alive. Still clinging to a barrel was the frozen body of Arne Wolf. He had not died from freezing, but from drowning like everyone else. But unlike everyone else, he did not drown in the water. He drowned from his own blood filling his lungs. Soon, the dead man's grip on the barrel popped free, his frozen fingers sliding free from where they had grasped the wood, and he sank out of sight into the water, leaving no trace of himself, of his brilliance, or that he was ever there behind. As far as history would be concerned, Captain Fitzstephen and his crew had all died in the sinking. If any passengers had noticed the swap, which was unlikely due to how much they had drunk before arriving on the ship, they likewise could not tell anyone of the strange oddity. And as far as history was concerned with Arne Wolf, he would simply be known as one of the Nazis who vanished after World War II and never faced well-deserved justice. However, it would be a secret lost to history that he indeed did. And for him, the method was the worst kind that it could have ever been. Half dead, John Bride continued to kick until his numb limbs felt like he couldn't move them anymore, but he still didn't stop. Not until he heard waves splashing ashore and could feel the bottom below him. Standing, he used all the strength he had left to wade, then crawl out of the freezing water and onto shore, within reach of the waves, where he collapsed. Freezing, having no energy left, he laid on the rocky shore, shivering and feeling like he was going to pass out. Finally, with a groan, he slowly got his arms under himself and sat up, slowly glancing back out at the waves. There was no sign of the ship. He knew she was gone, along with everyone, like it was supposed to be. The water and sky were dark, and where they met the horizon was barely distinguishable. He was about to fall back down into the sand and pass out in the surf when he saw a shape struggling in the shallow water near shore, not far back. Though he couldn't make out any of the details of the person, Bride knew in his gut who it was. It was Phillips. Bride saw him swim, the waves pushing him closer until the water was about knee-deep. Then Phillips tried to stand, but fell onto his hands, and then slumped down in the water and didn't move. A final bolt of energy, a last bit of adrenaline, shot through him, and he stood, running into the water. He grabbed Phillips under his arms and fell into the waves with him, holding his friend's head above the water. Phillips spat out a mouthful of seawater as Bride pulled him back to shore with him. Once he dragged him far enough back from the water, now beyond the reach of the waves, Bride felt his strength give out, and he collapsed onto his back, Phillips on top of him, and they both lay unconscious. The only sound that broke the stillness of the night were the waves crashing ashore. The calamity was over, and they were more thankful than ever to have solid ground under their feet once again. The next morning, the sky was clear, save a puffy white cloud or two drifting by, and seabirds flew overhead. From the calm stillness, one would not have guessed what kind of calamity had occurred the night before. There were no signs of the ship or the sinking. All the debris and any bodies that didn't sink were carried away by the current. The water was splashing on the rocks like nothing had happened. The only sounds were the birds and waves. Sitting side by side in the grass on a ridge overlooking the water below were Phillips and Bride. They were exhausted, half frozen, mentally and physically drained, perhaps more so than they had ever been in their lives. They were hungry, thirstier than they'd ever been, still sore from the cold water and cold air, but they were alive. They sat side by side and stared out at the water in silence for a long time, neither speaking. "Oh, what now?" Bride eventually asked. Philip shook his head and put his hand, which had been resting on his knee, over his forehead. "I don't know," he replied. "I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know where the vehicles and the machinery are from here. I don't even know where we are. We might be stuck." He looked over at Bride, who was pinching the bridge with his nose. "Hey," he said. "I think we both knew deep down this was going to be a risk as soon as we realized where we were. If we can't find our way back there, we'll make the best of it. At least, we'll know we stopped them." Bride slowly nodded. "Yeah, you were right," he said. Not about that. You were right that it was a loop. We were always here." "Yeah. And maybe, since it was a loop, that means we go home," Philip said, with a small, optimistic smile. Despite how exhausted he was, Bride returned it after a moment. "Does this mean VE Day is actually November 25th, 1120? He asked. Philip snorted, then laughed. "I think victory 800 years before the war even starts is pretty impressive," he said, smiling now. "We'll go home," he said. "I know it in my gut. Once we get our strength back, we'll figure out where we are and get back to the vehicles." They fell silent again afterward and just looked out at the water and listened to the crash of the waves. Then they noticed something away in the distance. There was a man stumbling along the beach towards them. Slowly he came nearer before climbing up the hill. The two sailors watched him come but didn't move. He eventually stumbled up the hill and past them, looking just as tired and half dead as they did. His clothes were ragged and he had a distant gaze in his eyes. He stopped for a moment and half turned to gaze at them, and the two sailors did the same. A knowing look was shared between them, but then he stumbled on and slowly walked past them without speaking. If he thought their appearances strange, he was obviously too tired to care. Phillips and Bride watched him go. "That must be Beryl," Bride said once he was gone. Phillips nodded. "The only one who survived. Out of everyone who was on board last night, he was the only one who made it." There had been a mutual understanding of shared trauma exchanged in their brief gaze, and the two sailors watched as he passed out of sight. Beryl had clung to the mast all night as it was slowly swept toward shore. Once it drifted to shore in the surf, Beryl, half frozen, had finally climbed off of it onto land, the only survivor of the sinking. Well, aside from the two others Arnie read about that history seemed to have forgotten about. Phillips mused. "We have a good friend 100 years in the future, and one 800 years in the past." He put a hand on Bride's shoulder. "My best one is in the present, though." They exchanged tired smiles and went back to gazing out at the English Channel. The roar of the waves was again the only sound. Several weeks later, the two sailors finally hiked their way back to where the vehicles had been hidden. The area of the forest was completely undisturbed. It was clear no one had found them in the meantime. They pulled the branches off the Volkswagen with the machinery in the back and climbed in. Phillips turned the key in the ignition, thankful that Arnie had ordered that all the vehicle keys be left inside them so they wouldn't become lost, since no one from the 12th century would know how to drive one even if they did happen to find them, so there was no risk of them being stolen. And the vehicle's engine sputtered for a moment, but then roared back to life. They listened to the engine for a moment before Phillips sighed and turned it back off. "It works," he sighed. Bride did as well. Then he and Phillips turned around and fiddled with the machinery in the back. For a moment, they paused and looked at it. It was the first time they'd ever seen the machinery used in the Philadelphia experiment, even if this was a reproduced miniaturized version. They just looked at it for a moment and thought about everything that its counterpart on the Eldridge had caused them to experience. On the machine were a number of keys built into it, numbers as well as a slash, commas, and a space bar that looked like they had come straight off of a typewriter. Also, a journal was stuffed into the back with it. Phillips pulled it out and opened it. Written in German on one page was, "If machine travel works as calculated, these are return date, time, and coordinates. If initial jump ended incorrectly, adjust accordingly." "I get it," Phillips said, dropping the journal in the seat. "I think." He typed in the numbers listed and heard accompanied ticks coming from inside the machine. Once he entered them, he eyed the only non-grammar key on the machine, a margin release key. He nodded. "That must turn it on," he said, turning around in the driver's seat and sitting there without moving. He and Bride sighed in relief. Not only now that they had gotten back, but also that they had a way home. Now that they knew they could get back and that they weren't stuck in 1120. They were able to finally just rest. Rest and take in everything that had happened to them in the last weeks and process it. "We really did make a difference," Bride smiled. Phillips did too, barely able to keep his eyes open. "We did," he agreed, sighing deeply and closing his eyes. Bride did the same. Sitting in the front seats of the Volkswagen, now that their adventure was truly over, now that history was saved, that the technology could now be kept a secret, and that they had a home to go back to after, they let their exhaustion finally hit them. They would go home to 1946, despite any reservation or doubts they might have been experiencing after the war ended about their choice to stay, and how tempting of an idea it was to just disappear and visit version 2 again. They both knew it truly now, without any doubts, that was where they belonged, in 1946 and the years to come. The numbers Arnie had written in his journal would take them to the same day they had left from, and only a short time after they originally left. It would be like they never even left when they returned. The other cars would have to be left behind, but there wasn't much the two could do about that except try to hide them more thoroughly before going. They were hidden in a forest already, so hopefully no one found them before they rusted and rotted away in a few decades. And even if they did, the two sailors thought it wouldn't matter. Medieval art depicted all kinds of strange things, such as knights fighting giant snails as if they were mighty dragons. So something resembling a car would likely not raise any eyebrows. Now that their worries were finally over, they let their exhaustion finally catch up to them, and they both fell into some much-needed sleep. June 2021. Sunlight pierced the ocean's surface, illuminating the sandy bottom 10 meters below the surface. A diver swam over the floor, examining the spot where currents had drug and partially buried a telltale piece of debris. A school of fish scattered above the diver in a stunning display of silver flashes of color as he passed along over the ocean floor. The diver swam past them to the bottom and examined what sparse bits of wreckage still lay exposed above the seabed, hidden amid the shallow water plants and shifting sands. What looked like part of a deck was exposed, seaweed growing from its ancient wooden planks. The diver took a picture of the spot. This was very promising. The team leader would be thrilled. The site was undisturbed, and if that was the ship they were hoping it was, then they would be the first people to see it in over 900 years. The diver, one of several swimming over the site, examining the wood for certain materials, construction designs, or other artifacts, was about to swim back to the surface to give a report when he paused. Something round was sticking out of the seafloor that did not look right. Knowing the site wasn't supposed to be disturbed, the diver still swam back and gave the sand one gentle brush just to get a better look. And his confusion only grew, and now he gently pulled the object from the seafloor. Grasping it, he swam back up to the surface and away from the wreck. He broke through the surface, blinked due to the bright glare of the sun, and pulled his respirator out of his mouth. Floating nearby was a large research ship, and the diver swam towards it. "Brock," he called. Brock Ballard, a young, fresh-out-of-college maritime archaeologist who was leading the investigation of the wreck of what they strongly believed was the famous White Ship, heard the voice and came out from the cabin and looked over the stern. "Oh hey, how's it looking?" he called. "Very promising," the diver said, swimming to the ladder hanging off the stern of the research vessel. "Got you some nice pictures of the deck up close. It's mostly buried, but there's some nice bits of it exposed. Seems like it very likely could be her. The length seems right, the materials seem right, the wood appears to be right, construction methods seem to fit the time. But I wanted to show you this. I know we're not supposed to touch the wreck, but this is something that was definitely not from it if it is the White Ship down there." "Okay, what do you have?" Ballard asked. The diver grabbed onto the ladder and then held up what he had pulled out of the hull. It was a steel World War II era German helmet. Ballard slid on some gloves and gently took the delicate, rusting object and held it up. "A Stahlhelm," he said. "That's odd." One of his fellow archaeologists had come out to the deck too, and he passed it to her. She gently turned it over in her gloved hands and gazed at it. "What do you think?" the diver asked. Ballard shrugged. "1,000 ways it could have ended up here. Some soldier might have thrown it into the water 80 years ago. Lost it. Might have been on someone who went down with the ship somewhere and the currents rolled it here. Who knows? Good it's out of the wreck, though, but if the current is pulling stuff here, I'm sure it's not the last out-of-place artifact we'll find. Just log it as an anomaly." He reached out, much more interested in the possibility of finding a lost ship from 900 years ago than he was caught up on how a much more recent artifact ended up with it when that could be as easily as explained as someone throwing it into the water during the war. "Now, let me see those pictures." The diver passed Ballard the camera and he went through them, standing up once he was done. "Oh, now this is a good start. Good work, everybody. Let's get back to work and keep it up. I want more pictures like this. I'm gonna go call Spencer as well and tell him we might actually have the ship here." As the study of the wreck continued, the helmet was passed to the archaeologists and the antiquity experts reviewing the artifacts, who cataloged it and then set it to the side as they focused on reviewing what they could see in the pictures. With every picture they looked at, they became more certain that they had found the White Ship. No one thought anything more about the helmet than it just being a weird coincidence that it ended up where it did. The White Ship disaster occurred on November 25th, 1120. Around 300 reportedly heavily intoxicated people, all members of the high class of Europe, were on board. These people included the heir and illegitimate children of King Henry I, members of the royal family, family of the Emperor of Rome, nobles of England and Normandy, and more. William Adeline, heir of King Henry I, would have escaped in the one lifeboat, but he died in the sinking when he went back to the ship to try and save his half-sister, who was calling out. The 50 crew members all also perished in the disaster. There was only one known survivor, a butcher named Berold. According to claims made in ancient texts written after the disaster, Captain Thomas Fitzstephen let himself drown rather than face the wrath of King Henry for the disaster. William Adeline's death in the sinking directly led to the civil war known as the Anarchy, 15 years later after the death of King Henry I. Today, The exact location of the wreck of the White Ship is unknown, but a strong candidate for the wreck has been found in the place where she was lost. A definitive conclusion on the matter has yet to be officially determined.